Chapter 16 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 16, The Fall of the City. Now when the Khalifa Abdullah saw that the last army that remained to him was broken, that all his attacks had failed, and that thousands of his bravest warriors were slain, he rode from the field of battle in haste, and, regaining the city, proceeded like a brave and stubborn soldier to make preparations for its defense, and, like a prudent man, to arrange for his own flight should further resistance be impossible. He ordered his great war drum to be beaten and the amya to be blown, and for the last time those dismal notes boomed through the streets of Omdurman. They were not heeded. The Arabs had had enough fighting. They recognized that all was lost. Besides, to return to the city was difficult and dangerous. The charge of the 21st Lancers had been costly, but it was not ineffective. The consequent retirement of the Dervish brigade protecting the extreme right exposed their line of retreat. The cavalry were resolved to take full advantage of the position they had paid so much to gain, and while the second attack was at its height, we were already trotting over the plain towards the long lines of fugitives who streamed across it. With the experience of the past hour in our minds, and with the great numbers of the enemy in our front, it seemed to many that a bloody day lay before us. But we had not gone far when individual dervishes began to walk towards the advancing squadrons, throwing down their weapons, holding up their hands, and imploring mercy. As soon as it was apparent that the surrender of individuals was accepted, the dervishes began to come in and lay down their arms, at first by twos and threes, then by dozens, and finally by scores. Meanwhile, those who were still intent on flight made a wide detour to avoid the cavalry, and streamed past our front at a mile's distance in uninterrupted succession. The disarming and escorting of the prisoners delayed our advance, and many thousands of dervishes escaped from the field. But the position of the cavalry and the pressure they exerted shouldered the routed army out into the desert, so that retiring they missed the city of Omdurman altogether, and, disregarding the Khalifa's summons to defend it and the orders of their emirs, continued their flight to the south. To harry and annoy the fugitives, a few troops were dismounted with carbines, and a constant fire was made on such as did not attempt to come in and surrender. Yet the crowds continued to run the gauntlet, and at least 20,000 men made good their escape. Many of these were still vicious, and replied to our fire with bullets, fortunately at very long range. It would have been madness for 300 lancers to gallop in among such masses, and we had to be content with the results of the carbine fire. While all this had been going on, the advance of the army on Omdurman was continuing. Nor was it long before we saw the imposing array of infantry topping the sandhills near Surgham and flooding out into the plain which lay between them and the city. High over the center brigade flew the black flag of the Khalifa, and underneath a smaller flash of red marked the position of the headquarters staff. The black masses of men continued to move slowly across the open ground while we fired at the flying Arabs, and at 12 o'clock we saw them halt near the river about 3 miles from the city. Orders now reached us to join them, and as the sun was hot, the day dragged, all were tired and hungry, and the horses needed water. We were not long in complying, and the remnants of the dervish army made good their retreat unmolested. We marched back to the Nile. The whole force had halted to drink, to eat, and to rest at Khor Shambat. The scene was striking. Imagine a 600-yard stretch of the Suez Canal. Both banks are crowded with brown or chocolate-clad figures. The northern side is completely covered with the swarming infantry of the British division. Thousands of animals, the horses of the cavalry, the artillery mules, the transport camels, filled the spaces and the foreground. Multitudes of khaki-clad men are sitting in rows on the slopes. Hundreds are standing by the brim or actually in the red muddy water. All are drinking deeply. 2 or 3 carcasses lying in the shallows show that the soldiers are thirsty rather than particular. On all sides water bottles are being filled from the welcome Nile, which has come into the desert to refresh the weary animals and men. During the attack on MacDonald's brigade, the Egyptian cavalry had watched from their position on the southern slopes of the Kerreri Hills, ready to intervene, if necessary, and support the infantry by a charge. As soon as the dervish onsets had ended and the whole mass had begun to retreat, Broadwood's cavalry brigade formed in 2 lines of 4 and of 5 squadrons, respectively, and advanced in pursuit, first west for 2 miles, and then southwest for 3 miles more towards the round-topped hill. Like the 21st Lancers, they were delayed by many dervishes who threw down their arms and surrendered, and whom it was necessary to escort to the river. But as they drew nearer the mass of the routed army, it became apparent that the spirit of the enemy was by no means broken. Stubborn men fired continually as they lay wounded, refusing to ask for quarter, doubting perhaps that it would be granted. Under every bush that gave protection from the lances of the horsemen, little groups collected to make a desperate stand. Solitary spearmen awaited unflinching the charge of a whole squadron. Men who had feigned death sprang up to fire an unexpected shot. The cavalry began to suffer occasional casualties. In proportion as they advanced, the resistance of the enemy increased. The direct pursuit had soon to be abandoned, but in the hope of intercepting some part of the retreating mob, Major Le Gallais, who commanded the 3 leading squadrons, changed direction towards the river, and galloping nearly parallel to Khor Shambat, charged and cut into the tail of the enemy's disordered array. The Arabs, however, stood their ground, and firing their rifles wildly in all directions, killed and wounded a good many horses and men, so that the squadrons were content to bring up their right still more, and finally to ride out of the hornet swarm into which they had plunged towards Surgham Hill. The pursuit was then suspended, and the Egyptian cavalry joined the rest of the army by the Nile. It was not until 4 o'clock that the cavalry received orders to ride round the outside of the city and harry such as should seek to escape. The Egyptian squadrons and the 21st Lancers started forthwith, and, keeping about a mile from the houses of the suburbs, proceeded to make the circle of the town. The infantry had already entered it, as was evident from a continual patter of shots and an occasional rattle of the Maxim guns. The leading Sudanese brigade, Maxwell's, had moved from Khor Shambat at 2:30, formed in line of company columns and in the following order. In the direction of advance, from left to right, the 14th Sudanese, the 12th Sudanese, Maxim guns, the 8th Egyptians, and then the 32nd Field Battery, followed by the 13th Sudanese. The Sirdar, attended by his whole staff, with the black flag of the Khalifa carried behind him and accompanied by the band of the 11th Sudanese, rode in front of the 14th Battalion. The regiments were soon enveloped by the numberless houses of the suburbs and divided by the twisting streets, but the whole brigade pressed forward on a broad front. Behind followed the rest of the army, battalion after battalion, brigade after brigade, until all, swallowed up by the maze of mud houses, were filling the open spaces and blocking and choking the streets and alleys with solid masses of armed men, who marched or pushed their way up to the Great Wall. For 2 miles the progress through the suburbs continued, and the general, hurrying on with his staff, soon found himself, with the band, the Maxims, and the artillery, at the foot of the Great Wall. Several hundred dervishes had gathered for its defense, but the fact that no banquette had been made on which they could stand to fire prevented their resistance from being effective. A few ill-aimed shots were, however, fired, to which the Maxim guns replied with vigor. In a quarter of an hour the wall was cleared. The Sirdar then posted 2 guns of the 32nd Field Battery at its northern angle, and then, accompanied by the remaining 4 guns and the 14th Sudanese, turned eastwards and rode along the foot of the wall towards the river, seeking some means of entry into the inner city. The breach made by the gunboats was found temporarily blocked by wooden doors, but the main gate was open, and through this the general passed into the heart of Omdurman. Within the wall the scenes were more terrible than in the suburbs. The effects of the bombardment were evident on every side. Women and children lay frightfully mangled in the roadway. At one place a whole family had been crushed by a projectile. Dead dervishes, already in the fierce heat beginning to decompose, dotted the ground. The houses were crammed with wounded. Hundreds of decaying carcasses of animals filled the air with a sickening smell. Here, as without the wall, the anxious inhabitants renewed their protestations of loyalty and welcome, and interpreters, riding down the narrow alleys, proclaimed the merciful conditions of the conquerors and called on the people to lay down their arms. Great piles of surrendered weapons rose in the streets, guarded by Sudanese soldiers. Many Arabs sought clemency, but there were others who disdained it, and the whirring of the Maxims, the crashes of the volleys, and a continual dropping fire attested that there was fighting in all parts of the city into which the columns had penetrated. All dervishes who did not immediately surrender were shot or bayoneted, and bullets whistled at random along or across the streets. But while women crowded round his horse, while sullen men filed carefully from houses, while beaten warriors cast their spears on the ground and others, still resisting, were dispatched in corners, the Sirdar rode steadily onward through the confusion, the stench, and the danger, until he reached the Mahdi's tomb. At the mosque, 2 fanatics charged the Sudanese escort, and each killed or badly wounded a soldier before he was shot. The day was now far spent, and it was dusk when the prison was reached. The general was the first to enter that foul and gloomy den. Charles Neufeld and some 30 heavily shackled prisoners were released. Neufeld, who was placed on a pony, seemed nearly mad with delight, and talked and gesticulated with queer animation. 13 years, he said to his rescuer, have I waited for this day. From the prison, as it was now dark, the Sirdar rode to the great square in front of the mosque, in which his headquarters were established, and where both British brigades were already bivouacking. The rest of the army settled down along the roadways through the suburbs, and only Maxwell's brigade remained in the city to complete the establishment of law and order, a business which was fortunately hidden by the shades of night. While the Sirdar with the infantry of the army was taking possession of Omdurman, the British and Egyptian cavalry had moved round to the west of the city. There for nearly 2 hours we waited, listening to the dropping fusillade which could be heard within the great wall, and wondering what was happening. Large numbers of dervishes and Arabs, who, laying aside their jibbahs, had ceased to be dervishes, appeared among the houses at the edge of the suburbs. Several hundreds of these, with 2 or 3 emirs, came out to make their submission, and we were presently so loaded with spears and swords that it was impossible to carry them, and many interesting trophies had to be destroyed. It was just getting dark when suddenly Colonel Slatin galloped up. The Khalifa had fled. The Egyptian cavalry were at once to pursue him. The 21st Lancers must await further orders. Slatin appeared very much in earnest. He talked with animated manner to Colonel Broadwood, questioned 2 of the surrendered emirs closely, and hurried off into the dusk, while the Egyptian squadrons, mounting, also rode away at a trot. It was not for some hours after he had left the field of battle that Abdullah realized that his army had not obeyed his summons, but were continuing their retreat, and that only a few hundred dervishes remained for the defense of the city. He seems, if we judge from the accounts of his personal servant, an Abyssinian boy, to have faced the disasters that had overtaken him with singular composure. He rested until 2 o'clock, when he ate some food. Thereafter he repaired to the tomb, and in that ruined shrine, amid the wreckage of the shell-fire, the defeated sovereign appealed to the spirit of Muhammad Ahmed to help him in his sore distress. It was the last prayer ever offered over the Mahdi's grave. The celestial councils seemed to have been in accord with the dictates of common sense, and at 4 o'clock the Khalifa, hearing that the Sirdar was already entering the city, and that the English cavalry were on the parade ground to the west, mounted a small donkey, and, accompanied by his principal wife, a Greek nun as a hostage, and a few attendants, rode leisurely off towards the south. 8 miles from Omdurman a score of swift camels awaited him, and on these he soon reached the main body of his routed army. Here he found many disheartened friends, but the fact that, in this evil plight, he found any friends at all must be recorded in his favor and in that of his subjects. When he arrived he had no escort, was indeed unarmed. The fugitives had good reason to be savage. Their leaders had led them only to their ruin. To cut the throat of this one man who was the cause of all their sufferings was as easy as they would have thought it innocent. Yet none assailed him. The tyrant, the oppressor, the scourge of the Sudan, the hypocrite, the abominated Khalifa, the embodiment, as he had been depicted to European eyes, of all the vices, the object, as he was believed in England, of his people's bitter hatred, found safety and welcome among his flying soldiers. The surviving emirs hurried to his side. Many had gone down on the fatal plain. Osman Azrak, the valiant Bishara, Yaqub, and scores whose strange names have not obscured these pages, but who were nevertheless great men of war, lay staring up at the stars. Yet those who remained never wavered in their allegiance. Ali Wad Helu, whose leg had been shattered by a shell splinter, was senseless with pain, but the Sheikh Ed-Din, the astute Osman Digna, Ibrahim Khalil, who withstood the charge of the 21st Lancers, and others of less note rallied to the side of the appointed successor of Muhammad Ahmed, and did not, even in this extremity, abandon his cause. And so all hurried on through the gathering darkness, a confused and miserable multitude, dejected warriors still preserving their trashy rifles, and wounded men hobbling pitifully along, camels and donkeys laden with household goods, women crying, panting, dragging little children, all in thousands, nearly 30,000 altogether, with little food and less water to sustain them, the desert before them, the gunboats on the Nile, and behind the rumors of pursuit and a broad trail of dead and dying to mark the path of flight. Meanwhile, the Egyptian cavalry had already started on their fruitless errand. The squadrons were greatly reduced in numbers. The men carried food to suffice till morning, the horses barely enough to last till noon. To supplement this slender provision, a steamer had been ordered up the river to meet them the next day with fresh supplies. The road by the Nile was choked with armed dervishes, and to avoid these dangerous fugitives, the column struck inland and marched southward towards some hills whose dark outline showed against the sky. The unknown ground was difficult and swampy. At times the horses floundered to their girths in wet sand. At others rocky khors obstructed the march. Horses and camels blundered and fell. The darkness complicated the confusion. At about 10 o'clock, Colonel Broadwood decided to go no further till there was more light. He therefore drew off the column towards the desert, and halted on a comparatively dry spot. Some muddy pools, which were luckily discovered, enabled the bottles to be filled and the horses to be watered. Then, having posted many sentries, the exhausted pursuers slept, waking from time to time to listen to the intermittent firing which was still audible, both from the direction of Omdurman and from that in which the Dervish army was flying. At 3 a.m. on the 3rd, Colonel Broadwood's force moved on again. Men and horses seemed refreshed, and by the aid of a bright moon the ground was covered at a good pace. By 7 o'clock the squadrons approached the point on the river which had been fixed for meeting the steamer. She had already arrived, and the sight of the funnel in the distance and the anticipation of a good meal cheered everyone, for they had scarcely had anything to eat since the night before the battle. But as the troopers drew nearer, it became evident that 300 yards of shallow water and deep swamp intervened between them and the vessel. Closer approach was prevented. There was no means of landing the stores. In the hopes of finding a suitable spot further up the stream, the march was resumed. The steamer kept pace along the river. The boggy ground delayed the columns, but by 2 o'clock 7 more miles had been covered. Only the flag at the masthead was now visible, and an impassable morass separated the force from the river bank. It was impossible to obtain supplies. Without food it was out of the question to go on. Indeed, great privations must, as it was, accompany the return march. The necessity was emphasized by the reports of captured fugitives, who all told the same tale. The Khalifa had pushed on swiftly, and was trying to reorganize his army. Colonel Broadwood thereupon rested his horses till the heat of the day was over, and then began the homeward march. It was not until 11 o'clock on the 4th of September that the worn-out and famished cavalry reached their camp near Omdurman. Such was the pursuit as conducted by the regular troops. Abdel Azim, with 750 Arabs, persisted still further in the chase. Lightly equipped and acquainted with the country, they reached Shageg, nearly 100 miles south of Khartoum, on the 7th. Here they obtained definite information. The Khalifa had 2 days' start, plenty of food and water, and many camels. He had organized a bodyguard of 500 Jihadiya, and was besides surrounded by a large force of Arabs of various tribes. With this numerous and powerful following he was traveling day and night towards El Obeid, which town was held by an unbeaten dervish garrison of nearly 3,000 men. On hearing these things the friendly Arabs determined, not unwisely, to abandon the pursuit, and came boastfully back to Omdurman. In the battle and capture of Omdurman, the losses of the expeditionary force included the following British officers killed: Captain G. Caldecott, 1st Royal Warwickshire Regiment; Lieutenant R. G. Grenfell, 12th Royal Lancers, attached 21st Lancers; the Honourable H. Howard, correspondent of the Times. In total, the British division and Egyptian army suffered 482 men killed or wounded. The dervish losses were, from computations made on the field and corrected at a later date, ascertained to be 9,700 killed, and wounded variously estimated at from 10,000 to 16,000. There were, besides, 5,000 prisoners. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 17. The Fashoda Incident. The long succession of events, of which I have attempted to give some account, has not hitherto affected to any great extent other countries than those which are drained by the Nile. But this chapter demands a wider view, since it must describe an incident which might easily have convulsed Europe, and from which far-reaching consequences have arisen. It is unlikely that the world will ever learn the details of the subtle scheme of which the Marchand mission was a famous part. We may say with certainty that the French government did not intend a small expedition, at great peril to itself, to seize and hold an obscure swamp on the Upper Nile. But it is not possible to define the other arrangements. What part the Abyssinians were expected to play, what services had been rendered them, and what inducements they were offered, what attitude was to be adopted to the Khalifa, what use was to be made of the local tribes, all this is veiled in the mystery of intrigue. It is well known that for several years France, at some cost to herself and at a greater cost to Italy, had courted the friendship of Abyssinia, and that the weapons by which the Italians were defeated at Adowa had been mainly supplied through French channels. A small quick-firing gun of continental manufacture and of recent make, which was found in the possession of the Khalifa, seems to point to the existence or contemplation of similar relations with the dervishes. But how far these operations were designed to assist the Marchand mission is known only to those who initiated them, and to a few others who have so far kept their own counsel. The undisputed facts are few. Towards the end of 1896 a French expedition was dispatched from the Atlantic into the heart of Africa under the command of Major Marchand. The reoccupation of Dongola was then practically complete, and the British government were earnestly considering the desirability of a further advance. In the beginning of 1897, a British expedition under Colonel MacDonald, and comprising a dozen carefully selected officers, set out from England to Uganda, landed at Mombasa, and struck inland. The misfortunes which fell upon this enterprise are beyond the scope of this account, and I shall not dwell upon the local jealousies and disputes which marred it. It is sufficient to observe that Colonel MacDonald was provided with Sudanese troops who were practically in a state of mutiny, and actually mutinied 2 days after he assumed command. The officers were compelled to fight for their lives. Several were killed. A year was consumed in suppressing the mutiny and the revolt which arose out of it. If the object of the expedition was to reach the Upper Nile, it was soon obviously unattainable, and the government were glad to employ the officers in making geographical surveys. At the beginning of 1898 it was clear to those who, with the fullest information, directed the foreign policy of Great Britain, that no results affecting the situation in the Sudan could be expected from the MacDonald expedition. The advance to Khartoum and the reconquest of the lost provinces had been irrevocably undertaken. An Anglo-Egyptian force was already concentrating at Berber. Lastly, the Marchand mission was known to be moving towards the Upper Nile, and it was a probable contingency that it would arrive at its destination within a few months. It was therefore evident that the line of advance of the powerful army moving south from the Mediterranean, and of the tiny expedition moving east from the Atlantic, must intersect before the end of the year, and that intersection would involve a collision between the powers of Great Britain and France. I do not pretend to any special information not hitherto given to the public in this further matter, but the reader may consider for himself whether the conciliatory policy which Lord Salisbury pursued towards Russia in China at this time, a policy which excited hostile criticism in England, was designed to influence the impending conflict on the Upper Nile, and make it certain, or at least likely, that when Great Britain and France should be placed in direct opposition, France should find herself alone. With these introductory reflections we may return to the theater of the war. On the 7th of September, 5 days after the battle and capture of Omdurman, the Tewfikia, a small dervish steamer, one of those formerly used by General Gordon, came drifting and paddling down the river. Her Arab crew soon perceived by the Egyptian flags which were hoisted on the principal buildings, and by the shattered condition of the Mahdi's tomb, that all was not well in the city. And then, drifting a little further, they found themselves surrounded by the white gunboats of the Turks, and so incontinently surrendered. The story they told their captors was a strange one. They had left Omdurman a month earlier, in company with the steamer Safia, carrying a force of 500 men, with the Khalifa's orders to go up the White Nile and collect grain. For some time all had been well, but on approaching the old government station of Fashoda, they had been fired on by black troops commanded by white officers under a strange flag, and fired on with such effect that they had lost some 40 men killed and wounded. Doubting who these formidable enemies might be, the foraging expedition had turned back, and the emir in command, having disembarked and formed a camp at a place on the east bank called Reng, had sent the Tewfikia back to ask the Khalifa for instructions and reinforcements. The story was carried to the Sirdar and ran like wildfire through the camp. Many officers made their way to the river where the steamer lay, to test for themselves the truth of the report. The woodwork of the hull was marked with many newly made holes, and cutting into these with their penknives, the officers extracted bullets, not the roughly cast leaden balls, the bits of telegraph wire or old iron which savages use, but the conical, nickel-covered bullets of small-bore rifles such as are fired by civilized forces alone. Here was positive proof. A European power was on the Upper Nile. Which? Some said it was the Belgians from the Congo. Some that an Italian expedition had arrived. Others thought that the strangers were French. Others again believed in the Foreign Office. It was a British expedition, after all. The Arab crew was cross-examined as to the flag they had seen. Their replies were inconclusive. It had bright colors, they declared, but what those colors were and what their arrangement might be they could not tell. They were poor men, and God was very great. Curiosity found no comfort but in patience or speculation. The camp, for the most part, received the news with a shrug. After their easy victory, the soldiers walked delicately. They knew that they belonged to the most powerful force that had ever penetrated the heart of Africa. If there was to be more war, the government had but to give the word, and the Grand Army of the Nile would do by these newcomers as they had done by the dervishes. On the 8th, the Sirdar started up the White Nile for Fashoda with 5 steamers, the 11th and 13th Battalions of Sudanese, 2 companies of the Cameron Highlanders, Peake's battery of artillery, and 4 Maxim guns. 3 days later he arrived at Reng, and there found, as the crew of the Tewfikia had declared, some 500 dervishes encamped on the bank, and the Safia steamer moored to it. These stupid fellows had the temerity to open fire on the vessels, whereat the Sultan, steaming towards them, replied with a fierce shell fire which soon put them to flight. The Safia, being under steam, made some attempt to escape, whither it is impossible to say, and Commander Keppel by a well-directed shell in her boilers blew her up, much to the disgust of the Sirdar, who wanted to add her to his flotilla. After this incident the expedition continued its progress up the White Nile. The Sud, which was met with 2 days' journey south of Khartoum, did not in this part of the Nile offer any obstacle to navigation, as the strong current of the river clears the waterway. But on either side of the channel a belt of the tangled weed, varying from 12 to 1,200 yards in breadth, very often prevented the steamers from approaching the bank to tie up. The banks themselves depressed the explorers by their melancholy inhospitality. At times the river flowed past miles of long grey grass and swampland, inhabited and habitable only by hippopotami. At times a vast expanse of dreary mudflats stretched as far as the eye could see. At others the forest, dense with an impenetrable undergrowth of thorn bushes, approached the water, and the active forms of monkeys and even of leopards darted among the trees. But the country, whether forest, mudflat, or prairie, was always damp and feverish, a wet land, steaming under a burning sun, and humming with mosquitoes and all kinds of insect life. Onward and southward toiled the flotilla, splashing the brown water into foam, and startling the strange creatures on the banks, until on the 18th of September they approached Fashoda. The gunboats waited, moored to the bank for some hours of the afternoon, to allow a message which had been sent by the Sirdar to the mysterious Europeans to precede his arrival, and early in the morning of the 19th a small steel rowing boat was observed coming downstream to meet the expedition. It contained a Senegalese sergeant and 2 men, with a letter from Major Marchand announcing the arrival of the French troops and their formal occupation of the Soudan. It, moreover, congratulated the Sirdar on his victory, and welcomed him to Fashoda in the name of France. A few miles further progress brought the gunboats to their destination, and they made fast to the bank near the old government buildings of the town. Major Marchand's party consisted of 8 French officers or non-commissioned officers, and 120 black soldiers drawn from the Niger district. They possessed 3 steel boats fitted for sail or oars, and a small steam launch, the Faidherbe, which latter had, however, been sent south for reinforcements. They had 6 months' supplies of provisions for the French officers, and about 3 months' rations for the men, but they had no artillery, and were in great want of small-arm ammunition. Their position was indeed precarious. The little force was stranded, without communications of any sort, and with no means of either withstanding an attack or of making a retreat. They had fired away most of their cartridges at the dervish foraging party, and were daily expecting a renewed attack. Indeed, it was with consternation that they had heard of the approach of the flotilla. The natives had carried the news swiftly up the river that the dervishes were coming back with 5 steamers, and for 3 nights the French had been sleeplessly awaiting the assault of a powerful enemy. Their joy and relief at the arrival of a European force were undisguised. The Sirdar and his officers on their part were thrilled with admiration at the wonderful achievements of this small band of heroic men. 2 years had passed since they left the Atlantic coast. For 4 months they had been absolutely lost from human ken. They had fought with savages. They had struggled with fever. They had climbed mountains and pierced the most gloomy forests. 5 days and 5 nights they had stood up to their necks in swamp and water. 1/5 of their number had perished, yet at last they had carried out their mission, and, arriving at Fashoda on the 10th of July, had planted the tricolour upon the Upper Nile. Moved by such reflections, the British officers disembarked. Major Marchand, with a guard of honour, came to meet the general. They shook hands warmly. "I congratulate you," said the Sirdar, "on all you have accomplished." "No," replied the Frenchman, pointing to his troops, "it is not I, but these soldiers who have done it." And Kitchener, telling the story afterwards, remarked, "Then I knew he was a gentleman." Into the diplomatic discussions that followed it is not necessary to plunge. The Sirdar politely ignored the French flag, and, without interfering with the Marchand expedition and the fort it occupied, hoisted the British and Egyptian colours with all due ceremony, amid musical honours and the salutes of the gunboats. A garrison was established at Fashoda, consisting of the 11th Sudanese, 4 guns of Peake's battery, and 2 Maxims, the whole under the command of Colonel Jackson, who was appointed military and civil commandant of the Fashoda district. At 3 o'clock on the same afternoon the Sirdar and the gunboats resumed their journey to the south, and the next day reached the mouth of the Sobat, 62 miles from Fashoda. Here other flags were hoisted, and another post formed with a garrison of half the 13th Sudanese battalion and the remaining 2 guns of Peake's battery. The expedition then turned northwards, leaving 2 gunboats, the Sultan and the Abu Klea, at the disposal of Colonel Jackson. I do not attempt to describe the international negotiations and discussions that followed the receipt of the news in Europe, but it is pleasing to remember that a great crisis found England united. The determination of the government was approved by the loyalty of the opposition, supported by the calm resolve of the people, and armed with the efficiency of the fleet. At first, indeed, while the Sirdar was still steaming southward, wonder and suspense filled all minds. But when suspense ended in the certainty that 8 French adventurers were in occupation of Fashoda and claimed a territory twice as large as France, it gave place to a deep and bitter anger. There is no power in Europe which the average Englishman regards with less animosity than France. Nevertheless, on this matter all were agreed. They should go. They should evacuate Fashoda, or else all the might, majesty, dominion, and power of everything that could by any stretch of the imagination be called British should be employed to make them go. Those who find it difficult to account for the hot, almost petulant flush of resolve that stirred the nation must look back over the long history of the Sudan drama. It had always been a duty to reconquer the abandoned territory. When it was found that this might be safely done, the duty became a pleasure. The operations were watched with extravagant attention, and while they progressed, the earnestness of the nation increased. As the tides of barbarism were gradually driven back, the old sea marks came one after another into view. Names of towns that were half forgotten, or remembered only with sadness, reappeared on the posters, in the gazettes, and in the newspapers. We were going back. Dongola, Berber, Metemmah. Who had not heard of them before? Now they were associated with triumph. Considerable armies fought on the Indian frontier. There was war in the south and the east and the west of Africa. But England looked steadfastly towards the Nile and the expedition that crawled forward slowly, steadily, unchecked, apparently irresistible. When the final triumph, long expected, came in all its completeness, it was hailed with a shout of exultation, and the people of Great Britain, moved far beyond their wont, sat themselves down to give thanks to their God, their government, and their general. Suddenly, on the course of their rejoicing, there broke a discordant note. They were confronted with the fact that a friendly power had, unprovoked, endeavored to rob them of the fruits of their victories. They now realized that while they had been devoting themselves to great military operations in broad daylight and the eye of the world, and prosecuting an enterprise on which they had set their hearts, other operations, covert and deceitful, had been in progress in the heart of the dark continent, designed solely for the mischievous and spiteful object of depriving them of the produce of their labors, and they firmly set their faces against such behavior. First of all, Great Britain was determined to have Fashoda or fight,
and as soon as this was made clear, the French were willing to give way. Fashoda was a miserable swamp, of no particular value to them. Marchand, Lord Salisbury's explorer in difficulties upon the Upper Nile, was admitted by the French minister to be merely an emissary of civilization. It was not worth their while to embark on the hazards and convulsions of a mighty war for either swamp or emissary. Besides, the plot had failed. Guy Fawkes, true to his oath and his orders, had indeed reached the vault, but the other conspirators were less devoted. The Abyssinians had held aloof. The Negro tribes gazed with wonder on the strangers, but had no intention of fighting for them. The pride and barbarism of the Khalifa rejected all overtures and disdained to discriminate between the various breeds of the accursed Turks. Finally, the victory of Omdurman and its forerunner, the Desert Railway, had revolutionized the whole situation in the Nile Valley. After some weeks of tension, the French government consented to withdraw their expedition from the region of the Upper Nile. Meanwhile, events were passing at Fashoda. The town, the site of which had been carefully selected by the old Egyptian government, is situated on the left bank of the river, on a gentle slope of ground which rises about 4 feet above the level of the Nile at full flood. During the rainy season, which lasts from the end of June until the end of October, the surrounding country is one vast swamp, and Fashoda itself becomes an island. It is not, however, without its importance, for it is the only spot on the west shore for very many miles where landing from the river is possible. All the roads, mere camel tracks, from Lower Kordofan meet at the government post, but are only passable in the dry season. The soil is fertile, and since there is a superabundance of sun and water, almost any crop or plant can be grown. The French officers, with the adaptive thrift of their nation, had already, in spite of the ravages of the water rats, created a good vegetable garden, from which they were able to supplement their monotonous fare. The natives, however, aboriginal Negroes of the Dinka and Shilluk tribes, are unwilling to work, except to provide themselves with the necessaries of life, and since these are easily obtained, there is very little cultivation, and the fertility of the soil may be said to increase the poverty of the country. At all seasons of the year the climate of Fashoda is pestilential, and the malarial fever attacks every European or Egyptian, breaking down the strongest constitutions, and in many cases causing death. The place is most unhealthy, and in March 1899, the driest season of the year, out of a garrison of 317 men, only 37 were fit for duty. From Sir William Garston's report, Egypt, No. 5, 1899. On this dismal island, far from civilization, health, or comfort, the Marchand mission and the Egyptian garrison lived in polite antagonism for nearly 3 months. The French fort stood at the northern end. The Egyptian camp lay outside the ruins of the town. Civilities were constantly exchanged between the forces, and the British officers repaid the welcome gifts of fresh vegetables by newspapers and other conveniences. The Senegalese riflemen were smart and well-conducted soldiers, and the blacks of the Sudanese battalion soon imitated their officers in reciprocating courtesies. A feeling of mutual respect sprang up between Colonel Jackson and Major Marchand. The dashing commandant of the 11th Sudanese, whose Egyptian medals bear no fewer than 14 clasps, was filled with a generous admiration for the French explorer. Realizing the difficulties, he appreciated the magnificence of the achievement, and as he spoke excellent French, a good and almost cordial understanding was established, and no serious disagreement occurred. But, notwithstanding the polite relations, the greatest vigilance was exercised by both sides, and whatever civilities were exchanged were of a formal nature. The Dinkas and Shilluks had on the first arrival of the French made submission, and had supplied them with provisions. They knew that white men were said to be coming, and they did not realize that there were different races among the whites. Marchand was regarded as the advance guard of the Sirdar's army. But when the Negroes gradually perceived that these bands of white men were at enmity with each other, were in fact of rival tribes, they immediately transferred their allegiance to the stronger force, and although their dread of the Egyptian flag was at first very marked, boycotted the French entirely. In the middle of October, dispatches from France arrived for Marchand by steamer, and that officer, after reading them, determined to proceed to Cairo. Jackson, who was most anxious that no disagreement should arise, begged him to give positive orders to his subordinate to maintain the status quo, as had been agreed. Marchand gladly consented, and departed for Omdurman, where he visited the battlefield, and found in the heaps of slain a grim witness of the destruction from which he had been saved, and so on to Cairo, where he was moved to tears and speeches. But in his absence Captain Germain, who succeeded to the command, diverged from his orders. No sooner had Marchand left than Germain, anxious to win distinction, embarked upon a most aggressive policy. He occupied the Dinka country on the right bank of the river, pushed reconnoitring parties into the interior, prevented the Dinka sheikhs from coming to make their submission at Fashoda, and sent his boats and the Faidherbe steam launch, which had returned from the south, beyond the northern limits which the Sirdar had prescribed and Marchand had agreed to recognize. Colonel Jackson protested again and again. Germain sent haughty replies and persisted in his provoking policy. At last the British officer was compelled to declare that if any more patrols were sent into the Dinka country, he would not allow them to return to the French post. Whereat Germain rejoined that he would meet force with force. All tempers were worn by fever, heat, discomfort, and monotony. The situation became very difficult, and the tact and patience of Colonel Jackson alone averted a conflict which would have resounded in all parts of the world. He confined his troops strictly to their lines, and moved as far from the French camp as was possible. But there was one dark day when the French officers worked in their shirts with their faithful Senegalese to strengthen the entrenchments, and busily prepared for a desperate struggle. On the other side little activity was noticeable. The Egyptian garrison, although under arms, kept out of sight, but a wisp of steam above the funnels of the redoubtable gunboats showed that all was ready. At length, in a fortunate hour, Marchand returned, reproved his subordinate, and expressed his regrets to Colonel Jackson. Then it became known that the French government had ordered the evacuation of Fashoda. Some weeks were spent in making preparations for the journey, but at length the day of departure arrived. At 8:20 on the morning of the 11th of December, the French lowered their flag with salute and flourish of bugle. The British officers, who remained in their own camp and did not obtrude themselves, were distant but interested spectators. On the flag ceasing to fly, a sous-officier rushed up to the flagstaff and hurled it to the ground, shaking his fists and tearing his hair in a bitterness and vexation from which it is impossible to withhold sympathy, in view of what these men had suffered uselessly and what they had done. The French then embarked, and at 9:30 steamed southward, the Faidherbe towing one oblong steel barge and one old steel boat, the other 3 boats sailing, all full of men. As the little flotilla passed the Egyptian camp, a guard of honor of the 11th Sudanese saluted them, and the band struck up their national anthem. The French acknowledged the compliment by dipping their flag, and in return the British and Egyptian flags were also lowered. The boats then continued their journey until they had rounded the bend of the river, when they came to land, and honor being duly satisfied, Marchand and his officers returned to breakfast with Colonel Jackson. The meeting was very friendly. Jackson and Germain exchanged most elaborate compliments, and the commandant, in the name of the 11th Sudanese, presented the expedition with the banner of the emir who had attacked them, which had been captured at Reng. Marchand shook hands all around, and the British officers bade their gallant opponents a final farewell. Once again the 8 Frenchmen, who had come so far and accomplished so much, set out upon their travels, to make a safe though tedious journey through Abyssinia to the coast, and thence home to the country they had served faithfully and well, and which was not unmindful of their services. Let us settle the international aspect of the reconquest of the Sudan while we are in the way with it. The disputes between France and England about the valley of the Upper Nile were terminated, as far as material cause was concerned, by an agreement, signed in London on the 21st of March, 1899, by Lord Salisbury and Monsieur Cambon. The declaration limiting the respective spheres of influence of the two powers took the form of an addition to the fourth article of the Niger Convention, concluded in the previous year. Its practical effect is to reserve the whole drainage system of the Nile to England and Egypt, and to engage that France shall have a free hand, so far as those powers are concerned, in the rest of northern Africa west of the Nile Valley, not yet occupied by Europeans. This stupendous partition of half a continent by two European powers could scarcely be expected to excite the enthusiasm of the rest. Germany was, however, soothed by the promise of the observance of the open-door policy upon the Upper Nile. Italy, protesting meekly, followed Germany. Russia had no interests in this quarter. France and England were agreed. The rest were not consulted, and the declaration may thus be said to have been recognized by the world in general. It is perhaps early to attempt to pronounce with which of the contracting powers the advantage lies. France has acquired at a single stroke, without any serious military operations, the recognition of rights which may enable her ultimately to annex a vast African territory. At present, what she has gained may be described as a recognized sphere of aspiration. The future may convert this into a sphere of influence, and the distant future may witness the entire subjugation of the whole region. There are many difficulties to be overcome. The powerful influence of the Senussi has yet to be overthrown. The independent kingdom of Wadai must be conquered. Many smaller potentates will resist desperately. Altogether, France has enough to occupy her in Central Africa for some time to come, and even when the long task is finished, the conquered regions are not likely to be of great value. They include the desert of the Great Sahara and wide expanses of equally profitless scrub or marsh. Only one important river, the Shari, flows through them, and never reaches the sea. And even Lake Chad, into which the Shari flows, appears to be leaking through some subterranean exit, and is rapidly changing from a lake into an immense swamp. Great Britain and Egypt, upon the other hand, have secured a territory which, though smaller, is nevertheless of enormous extent, more fertile, comparatively easy of access, practically conquered, and containing the waterway of the Nile. France will be able to paint a great deal of the map of Africa blue, and the aspect of the continent upon paper may please the patriotic eye, but it is already possible to predict that before she can develop her property, can convert aspiration into influence, and influence into occupation, she will have to work harder, pay more, and wait longer for a return than will the more modest owners of the Nile Valley. And even when that return is obtained, it is unlikely that it will be of so much value. It only remains to discuss the settlement made between the conquerors of the Sudan. Great Britain and Egypt have moved hand in hand up the great river, sharing, though unequally, the cost of the war in men and money. The prize belonged to both. The direct annexation of the Sudan by Great Britain would have been an injustice to Egypt. Moreover, the claim of the conquerors to Fashoda and other territories rested solely on the former rights of Egypt. On the other hand, if the Sudan became Egyptian again, it must wear the fetters of that imprisoned country. The capitulations would apply to the Upper Nile regions as to the Delta. Mixed tribunals, Ottoman suzerainty, and other vexatious burdens would be added to the difficulties of Sudan administration. To free the new country from the curse of internationalism was a paramount object. The Sudan Agreement by Great Britain and Egypt, published on the 7th of March, 1899, achieves this. Like most of the best work done in Egypt by the British agency, the agreement was slipped through without attracting much notice. Under its authority, a state has been created in the Nile Valley which is neither British nor Ottoman, nor anything else so far known to the law of Europe. international jurists are confronted with an entirely new political status. A diplomatic fourth dimension has been discovered. Great Britain and Egypt rule the country together. The Allied conquerors have become the joint possessors. What does this Sudan agreement mean? The Austrian consul general asked Lord Cromer, and the British agent, whom 22 years' acquaintance with Egyptian affairs had accustomed to anomalies, replied, "It means simply this," and handed him the inexplicable document under which the conquered country may some day march to peace and plenty. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 18 on the Blue Nile. The authority of the Khalifa and the strength of his army were forever broken on the 2nd of September, and the Battle of Omdurman is the natural climax of this tale of war. To those who fought, and still more to those who fell, in the subsequent actions the climax came somewhat later. After the victory, the public interest was no longer centered in the Sudan. The last British battalion had been carried north of Aswan, the last press correspondent had hurried back to Cairo or London, but the military operations were by no means over. The enemy had been defeated. It remained to reconquer the territory. The dervishes of the provincial garrisons still preserved their allegiance to the Khalifa. Several strong Arab forces kept the field. Distant Kordofan and even more distant Darfur were as quite yet unaffected by the great battle at the confluence of the Niles. There were rumors of Europeans in the far south. The unquestioned command of the waterways which the Sirdar enjoyed enabled the greater part of the Egyptian Sudan to be at once formally reoccupied. All towns or stations on the main rivers and their tributaries were at the mercy of the gunboats. It was only necessary to send troops to occupy them and to hoist the British and Egyptian flags. 2 expeditions were forthwith sent up the White and Blue Niles to establish garrisons, and as far as possible to subdue the country. The first, under the personal command of the Sirdar, left Omdurman on the 8th of September and steamed up the White Nile towards Fashoda. The events which followed that momentous journey have already been related. The second expedition consisted of the gunboats Sheikh and Hafir, together with 2 companies and the brass band of the 10th Sudanese and a Maxim battery, all under the command of General Hunter. Leaving Omdurman on the 19th of September, they started up the Blue Nile to Abu Haraz. The rest of the 10th Battalion followed as soon as other steamers were set free from the business of taking the British division to the Atbara and bringing supplies to Omdurman. The progress of the expedition up the river resembled a triumphal procession. The people of the riparian villages assembled on the banks, and partly from satisfaction at being relieved from the oppression of the Khalifa and the scourge of war, partly from fear, and partly from wonder, gave vent to loud and long-continued cheers. As the gunboats advanced, the inhabitants escorted them along the bank, the men dancing and waving their swords, and the women uttering shrill cries of welcome. The reception of the expedition when places of importance were passed, and the crowd amounted to several thousands, is described as very stirring, and, we are told, such was the enthusiasm of the natives that they even broke up their houses to supply the gunboats with wood for fuel. Whether this be true or not I cannot tell, but it is in any case certain that the vessels were duly supplied, and that the expedition in its progress was well received by the Negroid tribes, who had long resented the tyranny of the Arabs. On the 22nd of September, a considerable part of the army of Osman Digna, which had not been present at the Battle of Omdurman, was found encamped on the Gezira, a few miles north of Rafayeh. The sheikhs and emirs, on being summoned by General Hunter, surrendered, and a force of about 2,000 men laid down their arms. Musa Digna, a nephew of Osman and the commander of his forces, was put in irons and held prisoner. The rest, who were mostly from the Suakin district, were given a safe conduct and told to return to their homes, an order they lost no time in obeying. The next day the general arrived at Wad Medina, where the dervish garrison, 1,000 strong, had already surrendered to the gunboat Sheikh. These men, who were regular dervishes, were transported in sailing boats to Omdurman, and augmented the number of prisoners of war already collected. On the 29th of September, General Hunter reached Rosaires, 400 miles south of Khartoum, and the extreme limit of steam navigation on the Blue Nile. By the 3rd of October he had established garrisons of the 10th Sudanese in Rosaires, at Karkoj, at Sennar, the old seat of the government of the province, and at Wad Medina. Having also arranged for gunboat patrolling, he returned to Omdurman. But there was one dervish force which had no intention of surrendering to the invaders, and whose dispersal was not accomplished until 3 fierce and critical actions had been fought. Ahmed Fadil, a zealous and devoted adherent of the Khalifa, had been sent, after the defeat on the Atbara, to collect all the dervishes who could be spared from the Gedaref and Galabat provinces, and bring them to join the growing army at Omdurman. The emir had faithfully discharged his duty, and he was hurrying to his master's assistance with a strong and well-disciplined force of no fewer than 8,000 men when, while yet 60 miles from the city, he received the news of the stricken field. He immediately halted, and sought to hide the disaster from his soldiers by announcing that the Khalifa had been victorious and no longer needed their assistance. He even explained the appearance of gunboats upon the river by saying that these had run past the batteries at Omdurman and that the others were destroyed. The truth was not, however, long concealed, for a few days later 2 emissaries dispatched by Slatin arrived at the dervish camp and announced the destruction of the Omdurman army, the flight of the Khalifa, and the fall of the city. The messengers were authorized to offer Ahmed terms, but that implacable dervish flew into a rage, and having shot one, sent the other, covered with insults and stripes, to tell the Turks that he would fight to the bitter end. He then struck his camp and marched back along the east bank of the Blue Nile, with the intention of crossing the river near its confluence with the Rahad, and so joining the Khalifa in Kordofan. His dervishes, however, did not view this project with satisfaction. Their families and women had been left with large stores of grain and ammunition in Gedaref under a strong garrison of 3,000 men. They urged their commander to return and collect these possessions. Ahmed at first refused, but when on arriving at the place of passage he found himself confronted with a gunboat, he resolved to make a virtue of necessity, and set out leisurely for Gedaref. On the 5th of September, Colonel Parsons, in command of the forces at Kassala, heard through the Italian governor of Eritrea of the victory at Omdurman. The next day official news arrived from England, and in conformity with previous instructions, he set out on the 7th for Gedaref. It was known that Ahmed Fadil had marched towards Omdurman. It was believed that Gedaref was only weakly held, and the opportunity of cutting the most powerful remaining dervish army from its base was too precious to be neglected. But the venture was desperate. The whole available strength of the Kassala garrison was mustered, with these 1,350 motley soldiers, untried, little disciplined, worn with waiting and wasted by disease, without cavalry, artillery, or machine guns, and with only 7 British officers, including the doctor. Gedaref was taken, and having been taken, was held. After 2 long marches, Colonel Parsons and his force arrived at El Fasher, on the right bank of the Atbara. Their advance, which had hitherto led them through a waterless desert, was now checked by a raging torrent. The river was in full flood, and a channel of deep water, broader than the Thames below London Bridge and racing along at 7 miles an hour, formed a serious obstacle. Since there were no boats, the soldiers began forthwith to construct rafts from barrels that had been brought for the purpose. As soon as the first of these was completed, it was sent on a trial trip. The result was not encouraging. The raft supported 10 men, occupied 5 hours in the passage, was carried 10 miles downstream, and came back for its second journey on the afternoon of the next day. It was evident that this means of transport was out of the question. The only chance of success, indeed of safety, lay in the force reaching and taking Gedaref before the return of Ahmed Fedil. All depended upon speed, yet here was a hopeless delay. After prolonged discussion, it was resolved to act on the suggestion of an Egyptian officer and endeavor to build boats. The work proved easier than was anticipated. The elastic wood of the mimosa scrub supplied the frames. Some tarpaulins, fortunately available, formed the outer covering. The Egyptian soldiers, who delighted in the work, succeeded in making daily from such materials one boat capable of carrying 2 tons, and in these ingenious contrivances the whole force crossed to the further bank. The camels, mules, and horses of the transport, their heads supported with inflated water-skins tied under their jowls, were made to swim across the river by the local Shukriya Arabs. Such was the skill of these tribesmen that only 1 camel and 1 mule were drowned during the operation. The passage was completed on the 16th, and the next day the advance was resumed along the west bank of the Atbara. At midday on the 18th Mugatta was reached, and at dawn on the 20th the little force, having filled their water-skins, tightened their belts, and invoked the assistance of the various gods they worshipped, started off and marched all day in single file through the thick bush which lies between the Atbara and Gedaref. The column retired to rest peacefully during the night of the 21st, although within 12 miles of Gedaref. But at midnight startling news arrived. A deserter from the dervishes made his way into the camp and informed Colonel Parsons that the Emir Sa'adallah awaited him with 3,500 men 2 miles before the town. The situation was grave. A retreat through the broken country and thick bush in the face of a powerful and triumphant enemy seemed impossible. There was no alternative but to attack. Very early on the morning of the 22nd, the same day on which General Hunter on the Blue Nile was compelling Musa Digna and his followers to surrender, Colonel Parsons and the Kassala column set forth to march into Gedaref and to fight whatever force it might contain. For the first 2 hours the road lay through dhurra plantations and high grass which rose above the heads even of men mounted on camels. But as the town was approached, the dhurra ceased, and the troops emerged from the jungle onto an undulating moorland with occasional patches of rushes and withered grass. At 7:30, and about 3 miles from Gedaref, the enemy's scouts were encountered. A few shots were fired. The soldiers pressed their march, and at 8 o'clock had reached a small knoll, from the top of which an extensive view was obtainable. The column halted, and Colonel Parsons and his officers ascended the eminence to reconnoitre. A most menacing spectacle confronted them. Scarcely a mile away a strong force of dervishes was rapidly advancing to meet the invaders. 4 lines of white figures rising out of the grass showed by their length the number, and by their regularity the discipline, of the enemy. The officers computed the strength of their antagonists at not fewer than 4,000. Subsequent investigation has shown that the Emir Sa'adallah marched out of Gedaref with 1,700 riflemen, 1,600 spearmen, and 300 horse. The swiftness of the dervish advance and the short space that intervened between the forces made it evident that a collision would take place within half an hour. The valley was rocky and overgrown with grass and reeds, but to the right of the track there rose a high saddleback hill, the surface of which looked more open, and which appeared to command the approaches from Gedaref. The troops knew nothing of the country. The dervishes understood it thoroughly. The high ground gave at least advantage of view. Colonel Parsons resolved to occupy it. Time was, however, very scanty. The order was given, and the column began to double across the valley towards the saddleback. The dervishes, perceiving the nature of the movement, hurried their advance in the hope of catching the troops on the move, and perhaps of even seizing the hill itself. But they were too late. Colonel Parsons and his force reached the saddleback safely, and with a few minutes to spare climbed up and advanced along it in column in the direction of Gedaref, the Arab battalion leading, the 16th Egyptians next, and last of all the irregulars. The dervishes, seeing that the troops had already reached the hill and were moving along it towards the town, swung to their left and advanced to the attack. Thereupon, at 8:30, the column wheeled into line to meet them, and standing in the long grass, which even on the summit of the hill was nearly breast-high, opened a heavy and destructive fire. The enemy, although suffering severe loss, continued to struggle bravely onward, replying vigorously to the musketry of the soldiers. At 9 o'clock, while the frontal attack was still undecided, Colonel Parsons became aware that a strong force of dervishes had moved round the left rear and were about to attack the hospital and transport. He at once sent to warn Captain Fleming, RAMC, who combined the duties of medical officer and commander of the baggage column, of the impending assault, and directed him to close up the camels and meet it. The Arab sheikhs, who in the absence of officers were acting as orderlies, had scarcely brought the news to Fleming when the dervish attack developed. The enemy, some 300 strong, rushed with great determination upon the baggage, and the escort of 120 Arab irregulars at once broke and fled. The situation became desperate, but Ruthven with 34 supply department camelmen hastened to meet the exultant enemy and protect the baggage column, and the transport was stubbornly defended. In spite of all their efforts, the rear of the baggage column was broken and cut up. The survivors escaped along the saddleback. The British officers, with their small following, fell back towards the main body, hotly pressed by the enemy. At this moment Captain Ruthven observed one of his native officers lying wounded on the ground, about to fall into the hands of the dervishes and perish miserably. He immediately went back and, being a man of great physical strength, carried the body off in his arms. The enemy were, however, so close that he was 3 times compelled to set his burden down and defend himself with his revolver. Meanwhile, the retirement towards the main body continued and accelerated. Colonel Parsons and his force were now between 2 fires. The frontal attack was within 200 yards. The rear attack, flushed with success, were hurrying impetuously forward. The defeat and consequent total destruction of the Kassala column appeared certain. But in the nick of time the dervish frontal attack, which had been suffering heavily from the fire of the troops, wavered, and when the Arab battalion and the 16th Egyptians advanced upon them to complete their discomfiture, they broke and fled. Colonel Parsons at once endeavored to meet the rear attack. The Arab battalion, whose valor was more admirable than their discipline, continued to pursue the beaten enemy down the hill, but the 16th Egyptians, on being called upon by their commanding officer, Captain McCarroll, faced steadily about and turned to encounter the fresh attack. The heavy fire of the regular battalion checked the dervish advance, and Captain Fleming, the rest of the dismounted camelmen, and Ruthven still carrying his native officer, found safety in their ranks. For his gallantry on this occasion, Captain Ruthven has since received the Victoria Cross. A short, fierce musketry combat followed at a range of less than 100 yards, at the end of which the assailants of the baggage convoy were completely repulsed. The action was now practically over, and success was won. The Arab battalion, and those of the irregulars that had rallied, advanced and drove the enemy before them towards Gedaref, until at 10 o'clock, both their front and rear ranks having failed, the dervishes abandoned all resistance and a general rout ensued. No cavalry or artillery being available, further pursuit was impossible. The town of Gedaref surrendered at noon. The dervish emir, Nur Angara, who with 200 black riflemen and 2 brass guns had been left in command of the garrison, made haste to submit. The remainder of the dervishes, continuing their flight under the Emir Sa'adallah, hurried to tell the tale of defeat to Ahmed Fidil. The casualties suffered by the Kassala column in the action were severe in proportion to their numbers and the duration of the fight. The 7 British officers escaped untouched, but of the 1,400 soldiers and irregulars engaged, 51 were killed and 80 wounded, a total of 131. The dervishes left 500 dead on the field, including 4 emirs of rank. The victory had been won, the enemy were routed, and the town was taken. It had now to be defended. Colonel Parsons took possession of the principal buildings and began immediately to put them in a state of defense. This was fortunately an easy matter. The position was good and adaptable. It consisted of 3 large enclosures, capable of holding the entire force situated in echelon so as to protect each other by their fire, and with strong brick walls 6 feet high. All were at once set to work to clear the approaches, to level the mud houses without, and to build ramparts or banquettes within the walls. The 3 enclosures thus became 3 forts, and in the principal work the 2 captured brass guns were mounted in small bastions thrown out from the north and west corners. While the infantry were thus engaged, Ruthven and his camelmen made daily reconnaissances of the surrounding country, and eagerly looked for the first appearance of Ahmed Fedil. By great good fortune, a convoy of ammunition from Mugatta reached Gedaref on the afternoon of the 27th. At dawn the next day, Ruthven reported that the advance guard of Ahmed Fedil was approaching the town. The attack began at 8:30. The dervishes, who fought with their customary gallantry, simultaneously assaulted the north, south, and west faces of the defenses. Creeping forward through the high Dura, they were able to get within 300 yards of the enclosures. But the intervening space had been carefully cleared of cover, and was swept by the musketry of the defenders. All attempts to cross this ground, even the most determined rushes, proved vain. While some made hopeless charges towards the walls, others crowded into a few straw shelters and mud huts which the troops had not found opportunity to remove, and thence maintained a ragged fire. After an hour's heavy fusillade, the attack weakened, and presently ceased altogether. At 10 o'clock, however, strong reinforcements having come up, the dervishes made a second attempt. They were again repulsed, and at 11:15, after losing more than 500 men in killed and wounded, Ahmed Fedil admitted his defeat and retired to a clump of palm trees 2 miles to the west of the town. The casualties among the defenders were 5 men killed, 1 British officer, Captain Dwyer, and 13 men wounded. The dervishes remained for 2 days in the palm grove, and their leader repeatedly endeavored to induce them to renew the attack. But although they closely surrounded the enclosures and maintained a dropping fire, they refused to knock their heads against brick walls a 3rd time, and on the 1st of October Ahmed Fedil was forced to retire to a more convenient camp 8 miles to the southward. Here for the next 3 weeks he remained, savage and sulky, and the Kassala column were content to keep to their defenses. A few convoys from Mugatta made their way into the forts under the cover of darkness, but for all practical purposes the blockade of the garrison was complete. Their losses in action had reduced their strength. They were not abundantly supplied with ammunition. The smell of the putrefying corpses which lay around the walls and in the Dura crop, together with the unhealthy climate and the filth of the town, was a fertile source of disease. A painful and racking fever afflicted all ranks, and at one time as many as 270 of the 400 regular soldiers were prostrated. The recurring night alarms added to the fatigues of the troops and the anxieties of the 7 officers. The situation was indeed so unsatisfactory that Colonel Parsons was compelled to ask for assistance. Major General Rundle, who in the Sirdar's absence held the chief command, immediately organized a relief expedition. The 9th, 12th, and half of the 13th Sudanese, with 3 companies of the Camel Corps, under Colonel Collinson, were at once sent from Omdurman to the mouth of the Rahad River. The infantry were conveyed in steamers. The Camel Corps marched along the bank, completing the whole distance of 130 miles in 56 hours. The Blue Nile garrisons, with the exception of the post at Rosaires, were also concentrated. By the 8th of October, the whole force was collected at Abu Haraz. 500 camels, which had marched from Omdurman, and every available local beast of burden joined the transport of the column. On the 9th, the 12th Sudanese started up the Rahad River for Ain el Owega. From this point the road leaves the river and strikes across the desert to Gedaref, a distance of 100 miles, and in the whole distance water is only found at the wells of El Kau. Owing to the scarcity of water, it was necessary to carry a supply with the troops. The transport being insufficient to provide for the whole force, the march had to be made in 2 columns. The Camel Corps and the 12th Sudanese, about 1,200 strong, set forth under Colonel Collinson from Ain el-Owega on the 17th, and reached Gedaref safely on the 22nd. Warned of their arrival, Ahmed Fadil, having made a feeble night attack, which was repulsed by the garrison with a loss to themselves of 2 Sudanese wounded, realized that he had now no chance of recapturing the town. Preparations were indeed made to attack him, but on the 23rd of October, when a reconnaissance was made in the direction of his camp, the Dervish force was seen moving off in a southerly direction, their retreat covered by a strong rearguard, which was intended to perform the double duty of protecting the retirement and preventing desertion. The operations conducted by Colonel Parsons thus ended in complete success. Great difficulties were overcome, great perils were encountered, great results were obtained. But while we applaud the skill of the commander and the devotion of his subordinates, it is impossible not to criticize the rash and overconfident policy which sent such a weak and ill-equipped force on so hazardous an enterprise. The action of Gedaref, as has been shown, was, through no fault of the officers or men of the expedition, within an ace of being a disaster. But there were other critical occasions when only the extraordinary good fortune which attended the force saved it from destruction. First, the column was not discovered until it reached Mugata. Secondly, it was not attacked in the thick bush. Thirdly, the dervishes gave battle in the open instead of remaining within their walls, whence the troops could not have driven them without artillery. And fourthly, the reserve ammunition arrived before the attack of Ahmed Fadil. After his defeat before Gedaref, Ahmed Fadil reverted to his intention of joining the Khalifa in Kordofan, and he withdrew southwards towards the Dinder River with a following that still numbered more than 5,000. To pass the Nile in the face of the gunboats appeared impossible. He did not, however, believe that steamers could navigate the higher reaches of the rivers, and in the hopes of finding a safe crossing place, he directed his march so as to strike the Blue Nile south of Karkoj. Moving leisurely, and with frequent delays to pillage the inhabitants, he arrived on the Dinder, 25 miles to the east of Karkoj, on the 7th of November. Here he halted to reconnoitre. He had trusted in the Karkoj-Rosaires reach being too shallow for the gunboats, but he found 2 powerful vessels already patrolling it. Again frustrated, he turned southwards, meaning to cross above the Rosaires Cataract, which was without doubt impassable to steamers. On the 22nd of October, Colonel Lewis, with 2 companies of the Camel Corps and 3 squadrons of cavalry, started from Omdurman with the object of marching through the center of the Gezira and of re-establishing the Egyptian authority. His progress was in every way successful. The inhabitants were submissive, and resigned themselves with scarcely a regret to orderly government. Very little lawlessness had followed the defeat of the Khalifa, and whatever plundering there had been was chiefly the work of the disbanded irregulars who had fought at Omdurman under Major Wortley's command on the east bank of the Nile. In every village sheikhs were appointed in the name of the Khedive, and the officers of the cavalry column concerned themselves with many difficult disputes about land, crops, and women, all of which they settled to their satisfaction. Marching through Amwamra, Halusan, and Mesalamia, Colonel Lewis reached Karkoj on the 7th of November, almost at the same time that Ahmed Fadil arrived on the Dinder. For the next 6 weeks, the movements of the 2 forces resembled a game of hide-and-seek. Ahmed Fadil, concealed in the dense forest and jungle of the east bank, raided the surrounding villages and worked his way gradually towards the Rosaires Cataract. Colonel Lewis, perplexed by false and vague information, remained halted at Karkoj, dispatch vain reconnaissances in the hopes of obtaining reliable news, revolved deep schemes to cut off the raiding parties, or patrolled the river in the gunboats. And meanwhile sickness fell upon his force. The malarial fever, which is everywhere prevalent on the Blue Nile in the autumn, was now at its height. More than 30% of every garrison and every post were affected. The company holding Rosaires were stricken to a man, and only the 2 British officers remained fit for duty. The cavalry force which had marched through the Gezira suffered the most severely. One after another every British officer was stricken down and lay burning but helpless beneath the palm-leaf shelters, or tottered on to the friendly steamers that bore the worst cases north. Of the 460 men who composed the force, 10 had died, and 420 were reported unfit for duty within a month of their arrival at Karkoj. During the end of November, the Sheikh Bakir, who had deserted the dervishes after their retreat from Gedaref, arrived at Karkoj with 350 irregulars. He claimed to have defeated his former chief many times, and produced a sack of heads as evidence of his success. His loyalty being thus placed beyond doubt, he was sent to keep contact with the dervishes, and encouraged to the greatest efforts by the permission to appropriate whatever spoils of war he could capture. Meanwhile, Ahmed Fadil was working his way slowly southward along a deep khor which runs almost parallel to the Blue Nile, and is perhaps 20 miles from it. As soon as the position of the dervish emir was definitely known, Colonel Lewis moved his force, which had been strengthened by detachments of the 10th Sudanese, from Karkoj to Rosaires. Here he remained for several days, with but little hope of obstructing the enemy's passage of the river. On the 20th of December, however, full, though as was afterwards found not very accurate, information was received. It was reported that on the 18th Ahmed Fadil had reached the village of Dakhila, about 20 miles south of the Rosaires post, that he himself had immediately crossed with his advance guard, and was busily passing the women and children across the river on rafts. On the 22nd, therefore, Colonel Lewis hurried the Sheikh Bakir up the west bank to cut off their flocks and harass the dervishes who had already crossed the river. The irregulars accordingly departed, and on the next day news was brought that the dervish force was almost equally divided by the Blue Nile, half being on one bank and half on the other. At midday on the 24th, the gunboats Malik and Dal arrived from Omdurman with a detachment of 200 more men of the 10th Sudanese under Major Ferguson, and 30 men of the 9th Sudanese under Captain Sir Henry Hill. With this addition, the force at Colonel Lewis's disposal consisted of half the 10th Sudanese, a small detachment of the 9th Sudanese, 2 Maxim guns, and a doctor. Besides the regular troops, there were also the band of irregulars under the Sheikh Bakir, numbering 380 men, 100 men under the Sheikh of Rosaires, and a few other unclassified scallywags. Colonel Lewis determined to attack what part of Ahmed Fadil's force still remained on the east bank of the river, and on Christmas Day, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he marched with every man he could muster in the direction of Dakhila. Moving in single file along a track which led through a dense forest of thorny trees, the column reached Adu Zakoli, a village thought to be half, but really not 1/3, of the way to Dakhila, at 11 o'clock on Christmas night. Here they bivouacked until 3 a.m. on the 26th, when the march was resumed in the same straggling order through the same tangled scrub. Daylight found them still several miles from the dervish position, and it was not until 8 o'clock that the enemy's outposts were discovered. After a few shots the Arab picket fell back, and the advance guard, hurrying after them, emerged from the forest upon the open ground of the river bank, broken only by palms and patches of high grass. Into this space the whole column gradually debouched. Before them the Blue Nile, shining in the early sunlight like a silver band, flowed swiftly, and beyond its nearest waters rose a long, bare, gravel island crowned with clumps of sand hills,
to the shelter of which several hundred dervishes, surprised by the sudden arrival of the troops, were scampering. Beyond the island, on the tall tree-clad cliff of the further bank, other minute figures moved and bustled. The discordant sound of horns and drums floating across the waters, and the unfurling of many bright flags, proclaimed the presence and the intention of the hostile force. The dervish position was well chosen and of great defensive strength. A little to the north of Dakhila the Blue Nile bifurcates, one rapid but shallow stream flowing fairly straight under the east bank, another very deep stream running in a wide curve under the west bank, cutting into it so that it is precipitous. These two branches of the river enclose an island a mile and a quarter long by 1,400 yards wide, and on this island, surrounded by a natural moat of swiftly flowing water, was the dervish dem. The western side of the island rose into a line of low sandhills covered with scrub and grass, with a steep reverse slope towards the foreshore of the river bank, and here, in this excellent cover, what eventually proved to be 3/4 of the force of Ahmed Fadil were drawn up. Backed against the deep arm of the river, they had no choice, nor indeed any other wish, but to fight. Before them stretched a bare slope of heavy shingle, 1,000 yards wide, over which their enemies must advance to the attack. Behind them the high precipitous west bank of the river, which rose in some places to a height of 50 feet, was lined with the 300 riflemen who had already crossed, and from this secure position Ahmed Fadil and 4 of his emirs were able to watch, assist, and direct the defense of the island. The force on the island was under the sole command of the Emir Sa'adallah, of Gedaref repute, but, besides his own followers, most of the men of the 4 other emirs were concentrated there. The prospect was uninviting. Colonel Lewis discovered that he had absurdly underrated the strength and discipline of the dervish force. It had been continually reported that the defeats at Gedaref had demoralized them, and that their numbers did not exceed 2,000 men. Moreover, he had marched to the attack in the belief that they were equally divided on both sides of the river. Retreat was, however, impossible. Strong as was the position of the enemy, formidable as was their strength, the direct assault was actually safer than a retirement through the 19 miles of gloomy forest which lay between the adventurous column and Rosaires. The British officer immediately determined to engage. At 9 o'clock the 2 Maxims, which represented the artillery of the little force, came into action in good positions, while the 10th Sudanese and most of the irregulars lined the east bank. Musketry and Maxim fire was now opened at long range. The dervishes replied, and as the smoke of their rifles gradually revealed their position and their numbers, it soon became evident that no long-range fire could dislodge them, and Colonel Lewis resolved, in spite of the great disparity of force and disadvantage of ground, to attack them with the bayonet. Some time was spent in finding fords across the interposing arm of the river, and it was not until past 10 o'clock that Bakir's men crossed on to the island, and, supported by a company of the 10th Sudanese, advanced toward the enemy's right and took up a position at about 800 yards from their line, to cover the rest of the passage. Colonel Lewis now determined to turn the enemy's left from the north, attack them in flank, and roll them into the deep part of the river. With the 10th Sudanese, under Colonel Nason and Major Ferguson, he marched southwards along the river's edge, sheltering as far as possible under the curve of the bank from the fire, which now began to cause casualties. Having reached the position from which it was determined to deliver the attack, the battalion deployed into line, and changing front half left, advanced obliquely by alternate companies across the bare shingle towards the sandhills. As they advanced, a galling fire was opened upon the left flank by 200 dervishes admirably placed on a knoll. Major Ferguson was detached with 1 company to dislodge them. The remaining 4 companies continued the attack. The dervish musketry now became intense. The whole front of the island position was lined with smoke, and behind it, on the high cliff of the west bank,
A long half-circle of riflemen directed a second tier of converging bullets upon the 400 charging men. The shingle jumped and stirred in all directions as it was struck. A hideous whistling filled the air. The Sudanese began to drop on all sides, just like the dervishes at Omdurman, and the ground was soon dotted with the bodies of the killed and wounded. "We did not," said an officer, "dare to look back." But undaunted by fire and crossfire, the heroic black soldiers, demons who would not be denied, pressed forward without the slightest check or hesitation, and, increasing their pace to a swift run in their eagerness to close with the enemy, reached the first sandhills and found cover beneath them. A quarter of the battalion had already fallen and lay strewn on the shingle. The rapidity of their advance had exhausted the Sudanese, and Lewis ordered Nason to halt under cover of the sandhills for a few minutes, so that the soldiers might get their breath before the final effort. Thereupon the dervishes, seeing that the troops were no longer advancing, and believing that the attack was repulsed, resolved to clinch the matter. Ahmed Fadil from the west bank sounded the charge on drum and bugle, and with loud shouts of triumph and enthusiasm the whole force on the island rose from among the upper sandhills, and, waving their banners, advanced impetuously in counter-attack. But the 10th Sudanese, panting yet unconquerable, responded to the call of their 2 white officers, and, crowning the little dunes behind which they had sheltered, met the exultant enemy with a withering fire and a responding shout. The range was short, and the fire effective. The astonished Arabs wavered and broke, and then the soldiers, nobly led, swept forward in a long scattered line and drove the enemy from one sandy ridge to another, drove them across the rolling and uneven ground, every fold of which contained dervishes, drove them steadily back over the sandhills, until all who were not killed or wounded were penned at the extreme southern end of the island, with the deep, unfordable arm of the river behind them, and the fierce black soldiers, roused to fury by their losses, in front. The Sheikh Bakir, with his men and the rest of the irregulars, joined the victorious Sudanese, and from the cover of the sandhills, now in the hands of the troops, a terrible fire was opened upon the dervishes crowded together on the bare and narrow promontory and on the foreshore. Some tried to swim across the rushing river to their friends on the west bank. Many were drowned, among them Sa'adallah, who sank horse and man beneath the flood. Others took refuge from the fire by standing up to their necks in the stream. The greater part, however, escaped to a smaller island, a little further up the river. But the cover was bad, the deep water prevented further flight, and after being exposed for an hour and a half to the musketry of 2 companies, the survivors, 300 strong, surrendered. By 11:30 the whole island was in the possession of the troops. It was, however, still swept and commanded by the fire from the west bank. The company which had been detached to subdue the dervish riflemen were themselves pinned behind their scanty cover. Major Ferguson was severely wounded, and a third of his men were hit. To withdraw this company and the wounded was a matter of great difficulty, and it was necessary to carry the Maxims across the river and bring them into action at 400 yards. Firing ceased at last at 3 o'clock, and the victors were left to measure their losses and their achievement. There was neither time nor opportunity to count the enemy's dead, but it is certain that at least 500 Arabs were killed on the island. 2,127 fighting men and several hundred women and children surrendered. 576 rifles, large quantities of ammunition, and a huge pile of spears and swords were captured. Ahmed Fadil, indeed, escaped with a numerous following across the Gezira, but so disheartened were the dervishes by this crushing defeat that the whole force surrendered to the gunboat Matema at Reng, on the White Nile, on the 22nd of January, and their leader was content to fly with scarcely a dozen followers to join the Khalifa. The casualties among the troops in the action amounted to 41 killed and 145 wounded, including Major Ferguson, and the 10th Sudanese, on whom the brunt of the fighting fell, suffered a loss of 25 non-commissioned officers and men killed,
1 British officer, 6 native officers, and 117 non-commissioned officers and men wounded, out of a total strength of 511. The rest of the loss was among the irregulars, 495 of whom took part in the engagement. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. Chapter 19, the final chapter excepting the appendix, called The End of the Khalifa. By the operations described in the last chapter, the whole of the regions bordering on the Niles were cleared of hostile forces, dotted with military posts, and brought back to Egyptian authority. The Khalifa, however, still remained in Kordofan. After he had made good his escape from the battlefield of Omdurman, Abdullah had hurried in the direction of El Obeid, moving by the wells of Shat and Zeregia, which at that season of the year were full of water after the rains. At Abu Sharai, having shaken off the pursuit of the friendlies, he halted, encamped, and busily set to work to reorganize his shattered forces. How far he succeeded in this will presently be apparent. In the beginning of November, the general drying up of the country turned the wells at Abu Sharai into pools of mud, and the Khalifa moved westward to Agela. Here he was joined by the Emir El Khatem with the El Obeid garrison. This chief and his followers had never been engaged with the Turks, and were consequently fresh and valiant. Their arrival greatly encouraged the force which the Khalifa had rallied. A large dem was formed at Agela, and here, since the water was plentiful during December, Abdullah abode quietly, sending his raiding parties far afield to collect grain and other supplies. As soon as the Sirdar, who had returned from England, received the news of the success at Rosaires, he determined to make an attempt to capture the Khalifa, and on the 29th of December sent for Colonel Kitchener, to whom as the senior available officer he had decided to entrust this honorable enterprise. The colonel was directed to take a small mixed force into Kordofan and to reconnoiter the enemy's position. If possible, he was to attack and capture Abdullah, whose followers were believed not to exceed 1,000 ill-armed men. The Kordofan Field Force, as its officers called it, was formed as follows. Commanding, Colonel Kitchener. Assistant Adjutant General, Lieutenant Colonel Mitford. Deputy Assistant Adjutant General, Major Williams. The troops were composed of 2 squadrons of Egyptian cavalry, the 2nd Egyptians, the 14th Sudanese, 2 galloping Maxims, 2 mule guns, and 1 company of the Camel Corps. Camel transport was drawn from the Atbara and from the Blue Nile. The troops were conveyed by steamer to Duem and concentrated there during the first week in 1899. The camels were collected at Kawa, and although several of the convoys had to march as much as 400 miles, the whole number had arrived by the 10th of January. The prime difficulty of the operation was the want of water. The Khalifa's position was nearly 125 miles from the river. The intervening country is, in the wet season, dotted with shallow lakes, but by January these are reduced to mud puddles and only occasional pools remain. All the water needed by the men, horses, and mules of the column must therefore be carried. The camels must go thirsty until one of the rare pools, the likely places for which were known to the native guides, might be found. Now, the capacity of a camel for endurance without drinking is famous, but it has its limits. If he start, having filled himself with water, he can march for 5 days without refreshment. If he then have another long drink, he can continue for 5 days more. But this strains his power to the extreme. He suffers acutely during the journey, and probably dies at its end. In war, however, the miseries of animals cannot be considered. Their capacity for work alone concerns the commander. It was thought that, partly by the water carried in skins, partly by the drying up pools,
and partly by the camels' power of endurance, it might be just possible for a force of about 1,200 men to strike out 125 miles into the desert, to have 3 days to do their business in, and to come back to the Nile. This operation, which has been called the Churchill reconnaissance, occupied the Kordofan field force. The report of the route from Kohi was considered encouraging. At Jadid, the old wells promised sufficient water to refill the skins, and within 7 miles of the wells were 2 large pools at which the camels could be watered. The column, therefore, prepared for the journey. Nothing was neglected which could increase the water carried or diminish the number of drinkers. Only 12 cavalry were taken. The horses of the Maxim guns and the mules of the battery were reduced to the lowest possible number. Every person, animal, or thing not vitally necessary was remorselessly excluded. In order to lighten the loads and make room for more water, even the ammunition was limited to 100 rounds per rifle. The daily consumption of water was restricted to 1 pint for men, 6 gallons for horses, and 5 for mules. To lessen the thirst caused by the heat, Colonel Kitchener decided to march by night. An advance depot was formed at Jadid, and food for 2 days accumulated there. Besides this, each unit carried 10, and the column transport 7 days' rations. Thus the force was supplied with food up till the 9th of February, and their radius of action, except as restricted by water, was 19 days. This was further extended 5 days by the arrangement of a convoy which was to set out on the 30th of January to meet them as they returned. The column, numbering 1,604 officers and men, and 1,624 camels and other beasts of burden, started from Kohi at 3 p.m. on the 23rd of January, having sent on a small advance party to the wells of Jadid 12 hours before. The country through which their route lay was of barren and miserable aspect. They had embarked on a sandy ocean with waves of thorny scrub and withered grass. From the occasional rocky ridges, which allowed a more extended view, this sterile jungle could be seen stretching indefinitely on all sides. 10 miles from the river all vestiges of animal life disappeared. The land was a desert, not the open desert of the northern Sudan, but one vast, unprofitable thicket, whose interlacing thorn bushes, unable to yield the slightest nourishment to living creatures, could yet obstruct their path. Through this the straggling column, headed in the daylight by the red Egyptian flag, and at night by a lantern on a pole, wound its weary way, the advance guard cutting a path with axes and marking the track with strips of calico, the rear guard driving on the laggard camels and picking up the numerous loads which were cast. 3 long marches brought them on the 25th to Jadid. The first detachment had already arrived and had opened up the wells. None gave much water. All emitted a foul stench, and one was occupied by a poisonous serpent 8 feet long, the sole inhabitant. The camels were sent to drink at the pool 7 miles away, and it was hoped that some of the water skins could be refilled. But, after all, the green slime was thought unfit for human consumption, and they had to come back empty. The march was resumed on the 26th. The trees were now larger, the scrub became a forest, the sandy soil changed to a dark red color, but otherwise the character of the country was unaltered. The column rested at Abu Rakhba. A few starving inhabitants who occupied the huts pointed out the grave of the Khalifa's father and the little straw house in which Abdullah was wont to pray during his visits. Lately, they said, he had retired from Agela to Shirkela, but even from this latter place he had made frequent pilgrimages. At the end of the next march, which was made by day, the guides, whose memories had been refreshed by flogging, discovered a large pool of good water, and all drank deeply in thankful joy. A small but strong zeriba was built near this precious pool, and the reserve food and a few sick men were left with a small garrison under an Egyptian officer. The column resumed their journey. On the 29th they reached Agela, and here, with feelings of astonishment scarcely less than Robinson Crusoe experienced at seeing the footprint in the sand, they came upon the Khalifa's abandoned camp. A wide space had been cleared of bush, and the trees, stripped of their smaller branches, presented an uncanny appearance. Beyond stood the encampment, a great multitude of yellow speargrass dwellings, perfectly clean, neatly arranged in streets and squares, and stretching for miles. The aspect of this strange deserted town, rising, silent as a cemetery, out of the awful scrub, chilled everyone who saw it. Its size might indeed concern their leader. At the very lowest computation it had contained 20,000 people. How many of these were fighting men? Certainly not fewer than 8,000 or 9,000. Yet the expedition had been sent on the assumption that there were scarcely 1,000 warriors with the Khalifa. Observing every precaution of war, the column crawled forward, and the cavalry and camel corps, who covered the advance, soon came in contact with the enemy's scouts. Shots were exchanged, and the Arabs retreated. The column halted 3 miles to the east of this position, and, forming a strong zeriba, passed the night in expectation of an attack. Nothing, however, happened, and at dawn Mitford was set out with some mounted friendlies to reconnoiter. At 10 o'clock he returned, and his report confirmed the conclusions which had been drawn from the size of the Agela camp. Creeping forward to a good point of view, the officer had seen the dervish flags lining the crest of the hill. From their number, the breadth of front covered, and the numerous figures of men moving about them, he estimated not fewer than 2,000 Arab riflemen in the front line. How many more were in reserve it was impossible to say. The position was, moreover, of great strength, being surrounded by deep ravines and pools of water. The news was startling. The small force were 125 miles from their base, behind them lay an almost waterless country, and in front was a powerful enemy. An informal council of war was held. The Sirdar had distinctly ordered that, whatever happened, there was to be no waiting. The troops were either to attack or retire. Colonel Kitchener decided to retire. The decision having been taken, the next step was to get beyond the enemy's reach as quickly as possible, and the force began their retreat on the same night. The homeward march was not less long and trying than the advance, and neither hopes of distinction nor glamour of excitement cheered the weary soldiers. As they toiled gloomily back towards the Nile, the horror of the accursed land grew upon all. Hideous spectacles of human misery were added to the desolation of the hot, thorny scrub and stinking pools of mud. The starving inhabitants had been lured from their holes and corners by the outward passage of the troops, and hoped to snatch some food from the field of battle. Disappointed, they now approached the camps at night in 2s and 3s, making piteous entreaties for any kind of nourishment. Their appeals were perforce unregarded. Not an ounce of spare food remained. Towards the end of the journey the camels, terribly strained by their privation of water, began to die, and it was evident that the force would have no time to spare. One young camel, though not apparently exhausted, refused to proceed, and even when a fire was lighted round him, remained stubborn and motionless, so that, after being terribly scorched, he had to be shot. Others fell and died all along the route. Their deaths brought some relief to the starving inhabitants, for as each animal was left behind, the officers, looking back, might see first one, then another furtive figure emerge from the bush and pounce on the body like a vulture. And in many cases, before life was extinct, the famished natives were devouring the flesh. On the 5th of February, the column reached Kohi, and the Kordofan field force, having overcome many difficulties and suffered many hardships, was broken up, unsuccessful through no fault of its commander, its officers, or its men. For nearly a year, no further operations were undertaken against the Khalifa, and he remained all through the spring and summer of 1899 supreme in Kordofan, reorganizing his adherents and plundering the country, a chronic danger to the new government, a curse to the local inhabitants, and a most serious element of unrest. The barren and almost waterless regions into which he had withdrawn presented very difficult obstacles to any military expedition, and although powerful forces were still concentrated at Khartoum, the dry season and the uncertain whereabouts of the enemy prevented action. But towards the end of August, trustworthy information was received by the Intelligence Department through the agency of friendly tribesmen that the Khalifa, with all his army, was encamped at Jebel Gedir, that same mountain in southern Kordofan to which nearly 20 years before he and the Mahdi had retreated after the flight from Abba Island. Here among old memories, which his presence revived, he became at once a center of fanaticism. Night after night he slept upon the Mahdi's stone, and day after day tales of his dreams were carried by secret emissaries not only throughout the western Sudan, but into the Gezira and even to Khartoum. And now, his position being definite and his action highly dangerous, it was decided to move against him. On the 13th of October, the 1st Sudanese Battalion was dispatched in steamers from Khartoum, and by the 19th a force of some 7,000 men, well equipped with camel transport, was concentrated at Kaka, a village on the White Nile not far north of Fashoda. The distance from here to Jebel Gedir was about 80 miles, and as for the first 50 no water existed, the whole supply had to be carried in tanks. Sir Reginald Wingate, who was in command of the infantry, reached Fungor, 30 miles from the enemy's position, with the two leading battalions, the 9th and 10th Sudanese, on the 23rd of October, only to find news that the Khalifa had left his camp at Jebel Gedir on the 18th and had receded indefinitely into the desert. The cast having failed, and further progress involving a multiplication of difficulties, Lord Kitchener, who was at Kaka, stopped the operations, and the whole of the troops returned to Khartoum, which they reached in much vexation and disappointment on the 1st of November. It was at first universally believed that the Khalifa's intention was to retire to an almost inaccessible distance, to El Obeid or southern Darfur, and the officers of the Egyptian army passed an unhappy fortnight reading the Ladysmith telegrams and accusing their evil fortune which kept them so far from the scene of action. But soon strange rumors began to run about the bazaars of Omdurman of buried weapons and whispers of revolt. For a few days a vague feeling of unrest pervaded the native city, and then suddenly on the 12th of November came precise and surprising news. The Khalifa was not retreating to the south or to the west, but advancing northward with Omdurman, not El Obeid, as his object. Emboldened by the spectacle of two successive expeditions retreating abortive, and by, who shall say what wild exaggerated tales of disasters to the Turks far beyond the limits of the Sudan, Abdullah had resolved to stake all that yet remained to him in one last desperate attempt to recapture his former capital. And so, upon the 12th of November, his advance guard, under the Emir Ahmed Fedil, struck the Nile opposite Abba Island and audaciously fired volleys of musketry at the gunboat Sultan which was patrolling the river. The name of Abba Island may perhaps carry the reader back to the very beginning of this story. Here, 18 years before, the Mahdi had lived and prayed after his quarrel with the haughty sheikh. Here Abdullah had joined him. Here the flag of the revolt had been set up, and the first defeat had been inflicted upon the Egyptian troops. And here, too, still dwells, indeed, to this day, one of those same brothers who had pursued through all the vicissitudes and convulsions which had shaken the Sudan his humble industry of building wooden boats. It is surely a curious instance of the occasional symmetry of history that final destruction should have befallen the last remains of the Mahdist movement so close to the scene of its origin. The news which had reached Khartoum set all wheels in motion. The 9th and 13th Sudanese battalions were mobilized on the 13th of November and dispatched at once to Abba Island under Colonel Lewis. Kitchener hurried south from Cairo and arrived in Khartoum on the 18th. A field force of some 2,300 troops, one troop of cavalry, the 2nd Field Battery, the 1st Maxim Battery, the Camel Corps, 9th Sudanese, 13th Sudanese, and one company, the 2nd Egyptians, was immediately formed, and the command entrusted to Sir Reginald Wingate. There were besides some 900 Arab riflemen and a few irregular mounted scouts. On the 20th, these troops were concentrated at Fashoda, whence Colonel Lewis had obliged Ahmed Fadil to withdraw, and at 3:30 on the afternoon of the 21st, the expedition started in a southwesterly direction upon the track of the enemy. The troops bivouacked some 10 miles southwest of Fashoda, and then marched in bright moonlight to Nafisa, encountering only a dervish patrol of about 10 men. At Nafisa was found the evacuated camp of Ahmed Fadil, containing a quantity of grain which he had collected from the riverine district, and, what was of more value, a sick but intelligent dervish who stated that the emir had just moved to Abu A'adel, 5 miles further on. This information was soon confirmed by Mahmud Hussein, an Egyptian officer, who with an irregular patrol advanced boldly in reconnaissance. The infantry needed a short rest to eat a little food, and Sir Reginald Wingate ordered Colonel Mahon to press on immediately with the whole of the mounted troops and engage the enemy, so as to prevent him retreating before an action could be forced. Accordingly, cavalry, Camel Corps, Maxims, and irregulars, whose fleetness of foot enabled them, though not mounted, to keep pace with the rest, set off at their best pace, and after them at 9:15 hurried the infantry, refreshed by a drink at the water tanks and a hasty meal. As they advanced, the scrub became denser, and all were in broken and obstructed ground when, at about 10 o'clock, the sound of Maxim firing and the patter of musketry proclaimed that Mahon had come into contact. The firing soon became more rapid, and as the infantry approached it was evident that the mounted troops were briskly engaged. The position which they occupied was a low ridge which rose a little above the level of the plain, and was comparatively bare of scrub. From this it was possible at a distance of 800 yards to overlook the dervish encampment huddled around the water pools. It was immediately evident that the infantry and the battery were arriving none too soon. The dervishes, who had hitherto contented themselves with maintaining a ragged and desultory fire from the scrub, now sallied forth into the open and delivered a most bold and determined charge upon the guns. The intervening space was little more than 200 yards, and for a moment the attack looked as if it might succeed. But upon the instant the 9th and 13th Sudanese, who had been doubled steadily for upwards of 2 miles, came into line, filling the gap between Mahon's guns and dismounted Camel Corps and the irregular riflemen, and so the converging fire of the whole force was brought to bear upon the enemy, now completely beaten and demoralized. 2 dervishes, brothers, bound together hand and foot, perished in valiant comradeship 95 paces from the line of guns. Many were slain, and the remainder fled. The whole Egyptian line now advanced upon the encampment, hard upon the tracks of the retreating enemy, who were seen emerging from the scrub onto a grassy plain more than a mile away, across which, and further for a distance of 5 miles, they were pursued by the cavalry and the Camel Corps. 320 corpses were counted, and at least an equal number must have been wounded. Ahmed Fadil and 1 or 2 of his principal emirs escaped to the southward and to the Khalifa. The Egyptian loss amounted to 5 men wounded. The troops bivouacked in square formation at about 4 o'clock near the scene of action. A question of considerable difficulty and some anxiety now arose. It was learned from the prisoners that the Khalifa, with about 5,000 fighting men, was moving northwards towards the wells of Jadid, of which we have already heard in the Shirkela reconnaissance, and which were some 25 miles from the scene of the fight. The troops were already fatigued by their severe exertions. The water pool was so foul that even the thirsty camels refused to drink of it, and moreover scarcely any water remained in the tanks. It was therefore of vital importance to reach the wells of Jadid. But supposing exhausted troops famishing for water reached them only to be confronted by a powerful dervish force already in possession? Sir Reginald Wingate decided, however, to face the risk, and at a few minutes before midnight the column set out again on its road. The ground was broken, the night was sultry, and as the hours passed by the sufferings of the infantry began to be most acute. Many piteous appeals were made for water. All had perforce to be refused by the commander, who dared not diminish by a mouthful his slender store until he knew the true situation at Jadid. In these circumstances the infantry, in spite of their admirable patience, became very restive. Many men fell exhausted to the ground, and it was with a feeling of immense relief that at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 24th news was received from the cavalry that the wells had been occupied by them without opposition. All the water in the tanks was at once distributed, and thus refreshed the infantry struggled on and settled down at midday around a fine pool of comparatively pure water. At Jadid, as at Nafisa, a single dervish, and this time a sullen fellow, was captured, and from him it was learned that the Khalifa's army was encamped 7 miles to the southeast. It was now clear that his position was strategically most unfavorable. His route to the north was barred, his retreat to the south lay through waterless and densely wooded districts, and as the seizure of the grain supplies which had resulted from Fadil's foraging excursions rendered his advance or retirement a matter of difficulty, it seemed probable he would stand. Wingate therefore decided to attack him at dawn. Leaving the transport under guard by the water, with instructions to follow at 4 o'clock, the troops moved off at midnight, screened in front at a distance of half a mile by the cavalry and their flanks protected by the Camel Corps. The road was in places so thickly wooded that a path had to be cut by the infantry pioneers and the artillery. At 3 o'clock, when about 3 miles from the enemy's position, the force was deployed into fighting formation. The irregular riflemen covered the front, behind them the 13th and 9th Sudanese, and behind these, again, the Maxims and the artillery were disposed. Cautiously and silently the advance was resumed, and now in the distance the beating of war drums and the long booming note of the Khalifa's horn broke on the stillness, proclaiming that the enemy were not unprepared. At a few minutes before 4 o'clock, another low ridge, also comparatively bare of scrub, was reached and occupied as a position. The cavalry were now withdrawn from the front, a few infantry pickets were thrown out, and the rest of the force lay down in the long grass of the little ridge and waited for daylight. After about an hour, the sky to the eastward began to grow paler with the promise of the morning, and in the indistinct light the pickets could be seen creeping gradually in, while behind them along the line of the trees faint white figures, barely distinguishable, began to accumulate. Sir Reginald Wingate, fearing lest a sudden rush should be made upon him, now ordered the whole force to stand up and open fire, and forthwith, in sudden contrast to the silence and obscurity, a loud crackling fusillade began. It was immediately answered. The enemy's fire flickered along a wide half-circle and developed continually with greater vigor opposite the Egyptian left, which was consequently reinforced. As the light improved, large bodies of shouting dervishes were seen advancing, but the fire was too hot, and their emirs were unable to lead them far beyond the edge of the wood. So soon as this was perceived, Wingate ordered a general advance, and the whole force, moving at a rapid pace down the gentle slope, drove the enemy through the trees into the camp about 1.5 miles away. Here, huddled together under their straw shelters, 6,000 women and children were collected, all of whom, with many unwounded combatants, made signals of surrender and appeals for mercy. The ceasefire was sounded at 6:30. Then, and not till then, was it discovered how severe the loss of the dervishes had been. It seemed to the officers that, short as was the range, the effect of rifle fire under such unsatisfactory conditions of light could not have been very great. But the bodies thickly scattered in the scrub were convincing evidences. In one space not much more than a score of yards square lay all the most famous emirs of the once far-reaching dervish domination. The Khalifa Abdullah, pierced by several balls, was stretched dead on his sheepskin. On his right lay Ali Wad Helu. On his left, Ahmed Fidel. Before them was a line of lifeless bodyguards, behind them a score of less important chiefs, and behind these, again, a litter of killed and wounded horses. Such was the grim spectacle which in the first light of the morning met the eyes of the British officers, to some of whom it meant the conclusion of a perilous task prolonged over many years. And while they looked in astonishment not unmingled with awe, there scrambled unhurt from under a heap of bodies the little Emir Yunus of Dongola, who added the few links necessary to complete the chain. At Omdurman, Abdullah had remained mounted behind the hill of Surgham, but in this his last fight he had set himself in the forefront of the battle. Almost at the first discharge, his son Osman, the Sheikh ed-Din, was wounded, and as he was carried away he urged the Khalifa to save himself by flight. But the latter, with a dramatic dignity sometimes denied to more civilized warriors, refused. Dismounting from his horse, and ordering his emirs to imitate him, he seated himself on his sheepskin, and there determined to await the worst of fortune. And so it came to pass that in this last scene in the struggle with Mahdism, the stage was cleared of all its striking characters, and Osman Digna alone purchased by flight a brief ignoble liberty, soon to be followed by a long ignoble servitude. 29 emirs, 3,000 fighting men, 6,000 women and children surrendered themselves prisoners. The Egyptian losses were 3 killed and 23 wounded. The long story now approaches its conclusion. The river war is over. In its varied course, which extended over 14 years and involved the untimely destruction of perhaps 300,000 lives, many extremes and contrasts have been displayed. There have been battles which were massacres, and others that were mere parades. There have been occasions of shocking cowardice and surprising heroism, of plans conceived in haste and emergency, of schemes laid with slow deliberation, of wild extravagance and cruel waste, of economies scarcely less barbarous, of wisdom and incompetence. But the result is at length achieved, and the flags of England and Egypt wave unchallenged over the valley of the Nile. At what cost were such advantages obtained? The reader must judge for himself of the loss in men, yet while he deplores the deaths of brave officers and soldiers, and no less the appalling destruction of the valiant Arabs, he should remember that such slaughter is inseparable from war, and that, if the war be justified, the loss of life cannot be accused. But I write of the cost in money, and the economy of the campaigns cannot be better displayed than by the table below. Railway, 1,181,372 Egyptian pounds. Telegraph, 21,825 Egyptian pounds. Gunboats, 154,934 Egyptian pounds. Military expenditure, 996,223 Egyptian pounds, for total expenditure of 2,354,354 Egyptian pounds, and 1 Egyptian pound equals 1 pound sterling 6 pence. For something less than 2.5 millions sterling, active military operations were carried on for nearly 3 years, involving the employment, far from its base, of an army of 25,000 disciplined troops, including an expensive British contingent of 8,000 men, and ending in the utter defeat of an enemy whose armed forces numbered at the beginning of the war upwards of 80,000 soldiers, and the reconquest and reoccupation of a territory measuring 1,600 miles from north to south and 1,200 from east to west, from Lieutenant Colonel Stewart's report of Egypt, No. 11, 1883. Which at one time supported at least 20 millions of inhabitants. But this is not all. Of the total 2,354,354 Egyptian pounds, only 996,223 Egyptian pounds can be accounted as a military expenditure. For the remaining 1,358,131 Egyptian pounds, Egypt possesses 500 miles of railway, 900 miles of telegraph, and a flotilla of steamers. The railway will not, indeed, pay a great return upon the capital invested, but it will immediately pay something, and may ultimately pay much. The telegraph is as necessary as the railway to the development of the country. It costs far less, and when the Egyptian system is connected with the South African, it will be a sure source of revenue. Lastly, there are the gunboats. The reader cannot have any doubts as to the value of these vessels during the war. Never was money better spent on military plant. Now that the river operations are over, the gunboats discharge the duties of ordinary steamers, and although they are, of course, expensive machines for goods and passenger traffic, they are by no means inefficient. The movement of the troops, their extra pay, the supplies at the end of a long line of communications, the ammunition, the loss by wear and tear of uniforms and accoutrements, the correspondence, the rewards, all cost together less than $1 million sterling, and for that million Egypt has recovered the Sudan. The whole 2,354,354 Egyptian pounds had, however, to be paid during the campaigns. Towards this sum Great Britain advanced, as has been related, 800,000 pounds sterling as a loan, and this was subsequently converted into a gift. The cost to the British taxpayer of the recovery and part acquisition of the Sudan, of the military prestige, and of the indulgence of the sentiment known as the Avenging of Gordon, has therefore been 800,000 pounds sterling, and it may be stated in all seriousness that English history does not record any instance of so great a national satisfaction being more cheaply obtained. The rest of the money had been provided by Egypt, and this strange country, seeming to resemble the camel, on which so much of her wealth depends, has, in default of the usual sources of supply, drawn upon some fifth stomach for nourishment, and, to the perplexity even of those best acquainted with her amazing financial constitution, has stood the strain. The extraordinary expenditure in connection with the Sudan campaign, wrote Mr. J. L. Gorst, the financial advisor to the Khedive, in his note of December 20, 1898, note by the financial advisor on the budget of 1899, in Egypt No. 3, 1899, has been charged to the Special Reserves Fund. At the present moment this fund shows a deficit of 336,000 Egyptian pounds, and there are outstanding charges on account of the expedition amounting to 330,000 Egyptian pounds, making a total deficit of 666,000 Egyptian pounds. On the other hand, the fund will be increased, when the accounts of the year are made up, by a sum of 382,000 Egyptian pounds, being the balance of the share of the government in the surplus of 1898, after deduction of the excess administrative expenditure in that year, and by a sum of 90,000 Egyptian pounds, being part of the proceeds of the sale of the Khedivial postal steamers. The net deficit will therefore be 194,000 Egyptian pounds, and if the year 1899 is as prosperous as the present year, it may be hoped that the deficit will disappear when the accounts of 1899 are closed. A great, though perhaps academic, issue remains. Was the war justified by wisdom and by right? If the reader will look at a map of the Nile system, he cannot fail to be struck by its resemblance to a palm tree. At the top, the green and fertile area of the delta spreads like the graceful leaves and foliage. The stem is perhaps a little twisted, for the Nile makes a vast bend in flowing through the desert. South of Khartoum the likeness is again perfect, and the roots of the tree begin to stretch deeply into the Sudan. I can imagine no better illustration of the intimate and sympathetic connection between Egypt and the southern provinces. The water, the life of the delta, is drawn from the Sudan and passes along the channel of the Nile as the sap passes up the stem of the tree to produce a fine crop of fruit above. The benefit to Egypt is obvious, but Egypt does not benefit alone. The advantages of the connection are mutual, for if the Sudan is thus naturally and geographically an integral part of Egypt, Egypt is no less essential to the development of the Sudan. Of what use would the roots and the rich soil be if the stem were severed, by which alone their vital essence may find expression in the upper air? Here, then, is a plain and honest reason for the river war: to unite territories that could not indefinitely have continued divided, to combine peoples whose future welfare is inseparably intermingled, to collect energies which, concentrated, may promote a common interest, to join together what could not improve apart. These are the objects which, history will pronounce, have justified the enterprise. The advantage to Great Britain is no less clear to those who believe that our connection with Egypt, as with India, is in itself a source of strength. The grasp of England upon Egypt has been strengthened twofold by the events of the war. The joint action and ownership of the two countries in the basin of the Upper Nile form an additional bond between them. The command of the vital river is an irresistible weapon. The influence of France over the native mind in Egypt has been completely destroyed by the result of the Fashoda negotiations, and although she still retains the legal power to meddle in and obstruct all financial arrangements, that power, unsupported by real influence, is like a body whence the soul has fled, which may indeed be an offensive encumbrance, but must ultimately decompose and crumble into dust. But apart from any connection with Egypt, Britain has gained a vast territory which, although it would be easy to exaggerate its value, is nevertheless coveted by every great power in Europe. The policy of acquiring large waterways, which has been pursued deliberately or unconsciously by British statesmen for 3 centuries, has been carried one step further, and in the valley of the Nile England may develop a trade which, passing up and down the river and its complement the railway, shall exchange the manufactures of the temperate zone for the products of the Tropic of Cancer, and may use the north wind to drive civilization and prosperity to the south, and the stream of the Nile to bear wealth and commerce to the sea. This is the end of the 19th chapter, the final chapter, of the River War. What remains is a file containing the text of the Sudan Agreement, and also the declaration relative to the British and French spheres of influence in Central Africa, which were important political documents signed as a result of the war. If you choose to go no further, then thank you for listening.
Appendix 2, The River War. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain and is read by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The River War by Winston Churchill. The Appendix. Text of the Sudan Agreement of the 19th of January, 1899, and of the Declaration of the 21st of March, 1899. Agreement between Her Britannic Majesty's Government and the Government of His Highness the Khedive of Egypt relative to the future administration of the Sudan. Whereas certain provinces in the Sudan which were in rebellion against the authority of His Highness the Khedive have now been reconquered by the joint military and financial efforts of Her Britannic Majesty's Government and the Government of His Highness the Khedive, and whereas it has become necessary to decide upon a system for the administration of and for the making of laws for the said reconquered provinces, under which due allowance may be made for the backward and unsettled condition of large portions thereof, and for the varying requirements of different localities, and whereas it is desired to give effect to the claims which have accrued to Her Britannic Majesty's Government by right of conquest, to share in the present settlement and future working and development of the said system of administration and legislation, and whereas it is conceived that for many purposes Wadi Halfa and Suakin may be most effectively administered in conjunction with the reconquered provinces to which they are respectively adjacent. Now it is hereby agreed and declared by and between the undersigned, duly authorized for that purpose, as follows. Article 1. The word Sudan in this agreement means all the territories south of the 22nd parallel of latitude, which, 1.
have never been evacuated by Egyptian troops since the year 1882, or 2, which having before the late rebellion in the Sudan been administered by the government of His Highness the Khedive, were temporarily lost to Egypt, and have been reconquered by Her Majesty's government and the Egyptian government, acting in concert, or 3, which may hereafter be reconquered by the two governments acting in concert. Article 2. The British and Egyptian flags shall be used together, both on land and water, throughout the Sudan, except in the town of Suakin, in which locality the Egyptian flag alone shall be used. Article 3. The supreme military and civil command in the Sudan shall be vested in one officer, termed the Governor-General of the Sudan. He shall be appointed by Khedivial decree on the recommendation of Her Britannic Majesty's government, and shall be removed only by Khedivial decree, with the consent of Her Britannic Majesty's government. Article 4. Laws, as also orders and regulations with the full force of law, for the good government of the Sudan, and for regulating the holding, disposal, and devolution of property of every kind therein situate, may from time to time be made, altered, or abrogated by proclamation of the Governor-General. Such laws, orders, and regulations may apply to the whole or any named part of the Sudan, and may, either explicitly or by necessary implication, alter or abrogate any existing law or regulation. All such proclamations shall be forthwith notified to Her Britannic Majesty's agent and consul general in Cairo, and to the President of the Council of Ministers of His Highness the Khedive. Article 5. No Egyptian law, decree, ministerial arrete, or other enactment hereafter to be made or promulgated shall apply to the Sudan or any part thereof, save in so far as the same shall be applied by proclamation of the Governor-General in manner herein before provided. Article 6. In the definition by proclamation of the conditions under which Europeans, of whatever nationality, shall be at liberty to trade with or reside in the Sudan, or to hold property within its limits, no special privileges shall be accorded to the subjects of any one or more power. Article 7. Import duties on entering the Sudan shall not be payable on goods coming from Egyptian territory. Such duties may, however, be levied on goods coming from elsewhere than Egyptian territory, but in the case of goods entering the Sudan at Suakin, or any other port on the Red Sea littoral, they shall not exceed the corresponding duties for the time being leviable on goods entering Egypt from abroad. Duties may be levied on goods leaving the Sudan at such rates as may from time to time be prescribed by proclamation. Article 8. The jurisdiction of the mixed tribunals shall not extend, nor be recognized for any purpose whatsoever, in any part of the Sudan, except in the town of Suakin. Article 9. Until, and save so far as shall be otherwise determined by proclamation, the Sudan, with the exception of the town of Suakin, shall be and remain under martial law. Article 10. No consuls, vice-consuls, or consular agents shall be accredited in respect of, nor allowed to reside in the Sudan, without the previous consent of Her Britannic Majesty's government. Article 11. The importation of slaves into the Sudan, as also their exportation, is absolutely prohibited. Provision shall be made by proclamation for the enforcement of this regulation. Article 12. It is agreed between the two governments that special attention shall be paid to the enforcement of the Brussels Act of the 2nd of July, 1890, in respect to the import, sale, and manufacture of firearms and their munitions, and distilled or spirituous liquors. Done in Cairo, the 19th of January, 1899. Signed, Boutros Ghali Cromer. Declaration relative to the British and French spheres of influence in Central Africa. Signed at London, March 21, 1899. The undersigned, duly authorized by their governments, have signed the following declaration. The fourth article of the Convention of the 14th of June, 1898, shall be completed by the following provisions, which shall be considered as forming an integral part of it. 1. Her Britannic Majesty's government engages not to acquire either territory or political influence to the west of the line of frontier defined in the following paragraph, and the government of the French Republic engages not to acquire either territory or political influence to the east of the same line. 2. The line of frontier shall start from the point where the boundary between the Congo Free State and French territory meets the water parting between the watershed of the Nile and that of the Congo and its affluents. It shall follow in principle that water parting up to its intersection with the 11th parallel of north latitude. From this point it shall be drawn as far as the 15th parallel in such manner as to separate, in principle, the kingdom of Wadai from what constituted in 1882 the province of Darfur, but it shall in no case be so drawn as to pass to the west beyond the 21st degree of longitude east of Greenwich, 18 degrees 40 minutes east of Paris, or to the east beyond the 23rd degree of longitude east of Greenwich, 20 degrees 40 minutes east of Paris. 3. It is understood in principle that to the north of the 15th parallel the French zone shall be limited to the northeast and east by a line which shall start from the point of intersection of the Tropic of Cancer with the 16th degree of longitude east of Greenwich, 18 degree 40 minute east of Paris, shall run thence to the southeast until it meets the 24th degree of longitude east of Greenwich, 21 degrees 40 minutes east of Paris, and shall then follow the 24th degree until it meets, to the north of the 15th parallel of latitude, the frontier of Darfur as it shall eventually be fixed. 4. The two governments engage to appoint commissioners who shall be charged to delimit on the spot a frontier line in accordance with the indications given in paragraph 2 of this declaration. The result of their work shall be submitted for the approbation of their respective governments. It is agreed that the provisions of Article 9 of the Convention of the 14th of June, 1898, shall apply equally to the territories situated to the south of the 14 degree 20 minute parallel of north latitude and to the north of the 5th parallel of north latitude, between the 14 degree 20 minute meridian of longitude east of Greenwich, the 12th degree east of Paris, and the course of the Upper Nile. Done at London, the 21st of March, 1899. Signatures by Salisbury and Paul Cambon. That is the end of The River War by Winston Churchill. Thank you for listening.